I just got done reading through Bob Holly's book, and my god, this dude was, and probably still is, absolutely unhinged. The amount of quotes I found in this book that were either controversial, funny, or just downright ridiculous is completely off the charts. So today, I'm going to save you the hassle by reading some of the more juicy bits found in old bombastic Bob's autobiography. I will say, it's actually a good read and you should most definitely pick it up, though Bob wants to make it very, very clear that he's a real hard man. You do end up rolling your eyes quite a few times because there's absolutely nothing more important to Holly than protecting his own self-image of being a tough guy. But admittedly, it does make for some good reading too. Holly rips apart everyone while he himself is always in the right. No one's safe, including Shawn Michaels, John Cena, Triple H and others. So let's start as I pick out a few paragraphs from Bob's life story. Keep in mind that these quotes have been abridged just to make them a bit easier to digest in video form. So do check out the full book if you want things a little more fleshed out. I wanted to get the Click out of the way first because this is what most people already know about, and many are familiar with what Bob had to say about Shawn Michaels and company. In short, Bob Holly hated the Click. He dedicates a whole chapter to the boys and he keeps bringing them up as the book goes on. So here's some of the better bits. Before Triple H, Shawn was the biggest asshole in the company. He was a complete dick. When I started, he had been decent to me, but as time went on, he turned into an arrogant smartass. We were in Europe when I first butted heads with the Click. After my match on our first night in Germany, I got showered and dressed, then went to the kitchen to get my food. It wasn't there. I thought that was a little strange. Same thing the next night and the night after that. I went with Rick Martel into the kitchen the next day and again my food wasn't there. Rick asked what was going on and I told him my food had been missing for the past 3 nights. I said I'd been filling my card out but there was never any food. Rick looked around with me. He didn't find any food but he found my card. It was torn into pieces on the floor. I figured this was somebody's way of ribbing me, but to me that's a dirty rib. You don't mess with somebody's food or clothing. Randy Savage would inform Bob that it was HBK who tore up his food order card, so Holly went and paid Shawn Michaels a visit. HBK and Scott Hall were in the showers. "Don't worry, I've got this," and I shut the door behind me. Scott Hall was milling around and Shawn had just got done in the shower. I said, "Shawn, what's your fucking problem with me?" He looked at me and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I said, "The f*** you don't know? I don't think I need to remind you. If you have a problem with me, you come up to me and discuss it with me, but the next time you touch my fucking food, I swear to God, I will cut all your fingers off with bolt cutters. Do not fuck with me." Scott jumped in and tried to be a tough guy, so I turned to him and said, "Motherfucker, don't come any closer or I will fucking drop you." He backed up, playing all cool and everything, and said, "Hey, come on, there's no need for this." I responded, "I'm nobody to fuck with, Scott, don't try me." Shawn didn't say a word. I turned around and walked out of there. Randy and Rick were standing outside the door, laughing and carrying on. Randy looked at me and said, "That's the way you fucking handle things, right there." I wasn't done with the Click though. The next day, as I was heading into catering, I saw Scott and Kevin Nash sitting on one of those stage equipment boxes, being dicks to everybody who went by. Kevin smarted off at me, so I stopped, looked at him straight in the eye, and in front of everybody said, "You say one more word to me and I will knock your ass out." Then I drew an X on his chin with my finger and said, "This is where I'm going to hit you." Nash couldn't believe it. Everyone tiptoed around backstage because they knew the members of the Click had a lot of influence over Vince and were more than happy to use it. Everyone was job scared. The Click just kept on f***ing with people and wanting to work with only each other, hogging all the money. Bob had some choice words for Shawn Michaels, but he also had quite a lot to say about Triple H, both in regards to Hunter becoming associated with the Click and Hunter gaining power within the WWF. Triple H figured out pretty quickly that if you wanted to get somewhere, you had to be in Shawn and Kevin's circle. If you ever meet Hunter, he'll suck you right in. He's a likeable guy, he comes across well, he's very intelligent, very charming, and he has a great mind for the business. Shawn and Kevin let him in, although they sort of used him as a bag boy for a while to carry their luggage. Maybe that's where I went wrong. If I'd have gone up to Shawn and kissed his ass, maybe I would have gotten a bigger push. Instead, I travelled with guys who they didn't like, so I ended up guilty by association. It took me years to understand that it's not just about being a good wrestler and having a good look, it's about playing the game, and Hunter played it better than anyone. He always buried Jericho, he nearly got him fired. So many guys could have been a lot more than they ended up being. Kane, Booker, RVD, all buried by Hunter. Rob Van Dam could have been huge. CM Punk is one of the top guys now, but he could have been the guy. Even though Hunter never liked him, they had no choice but to go with Punk because he got over. You'll notice that Hunter made sure to go over him though, to make sure everybody knew Punk wasn't on Hunter's level. Where's the sense in that? It's got to be insecurity. It's strange because he's such a great wrestler, but when it comes to company politics, if he doesn't like you, he'll f*** you over, no matter how good you are. It's a crying shame. Face to face, he acts like he's your best friend, but as soon as you turn away, out comes the knife. I'm not going to mention names because the people in question still work for the company, but I was told several times by several people that Hunter used to bury me directly to Vince in meetings. Bret Hart hit the nail on the head when he said that Hunter tries to keep all the money for his cronies. When they started up the Generation X again in 2006, Billy, Road Dogg and X-Pac wanted to come in, but Hunter put the kibosh on that. He wanted to keep it just him and Shawn so they could split the merchandise royalties 2 ways rather than 5. The only wrestler they paid well in Memphis was Jeff Jarrett. He was driving around in a nice vehicle and making a ton of money. What could any of us say to him? His dad was the promoter. Jeff was a real dickhead back then, still is as far as I'm concerned. He reminds me a lot of Triple H, and that's not a good thing. Jeff will stab you in the back because he's not man enough to stab you in the front. When you talk to him face to face, he's charming and he'll suck you in, make you feel like you can trust him. But as soon as you're gone, he'll bury you and you'll never know it. He's the furthest thing from a man. I honestly don't think Jeff would have gone anywhere in the wrestling business if he hadn't have been Jerry Jarrett's kid. He and Road Dogg were good friends, or so Road Dogg thought. When Jeff wanted to leave the WWF, Road Dogg stuck with him and he left too. But when they got to Atlanta, WCW only wanted Jarrett. Jeff didn't go to bat for Road Dogg, he just took the offer WCW gave him and he left his so-called friend behind without a job. Jeff's a charming guy to your face, but I wouldn't trust him as far as I could throw him. Hardcore Holly's tough as nails, everyone, and you better remember it. In his book, he talked about some guys who can fight and some guys who can't. Here's what he had to say. In the make-believe world of wrestling, some of the champions wouldn't do too well in a real fight. Cena can't fight. Triple H genuinely thinks he's a badass motherfucker and he really isn't. Kevin Nash picked his spots. He would only call out guys he knew he could take. He wouldn't have fought me because he knew I'd kill him. Steve Austin wasn't as tough as they made him out to be. I like Steve, but that's the truth. I'm not saying these guys are pussies, but I wouldn't want them to be backing me up in a bar fight. I'd want Blackman, Bradshaw and Ron Simmons. Those are the guys to have in your corner. Not only did Bombastic Bob say John Cena can't fight, he said he also can't wrestle twice. Shawn Michaels is the greatest wrestler of all time, hands down. If you want proof, go watch the hour-long match he did with John Cena on Raw in England back in 2007. Cena can't wrestle and he can't lead a match. Every single bit of that match was Shawn. He carried Cena for a full hour. The main event of WrestleMania in 2011 was John Cena vs The Miz, and it was horrible. Despite the fact that John's pretty much the hardest working man in WWE, he's not a good wrestler. Miz isn't much better. He's improved, but he's nowhere near good enough to be WWF champion and main eventing the biggest show of the year. Bob fully admits in his book that he was on the juice, but he also questioned the strictness of WWE's wellness policy, alleging that certain guys got off the hook while expendable guys got suspended. I'll be the first to admit that I was on the gas. So was almost every single person in that locker room in the 80s, 90s and into the 2000s. I'm not ashamed of it. Personally, I'd rather be in the ring with a guy who's gassed to the gills than a guy who's high as a kite. When they brought in the wellness policy, we were told by management that tests were going to be random and regular. Everybody was eligible to be tested, and anyone who tested positive for any banned substance would be suspended unless they had a valid prescription. We were also told that the office had no say in who would be suspended. That would be down to the company running our testing. But the whole program was a joke. Certain guys started losing weight and muscle mass, but other guys stayed the same size. Go back and look and you'll see who was on and who was off. It became clear to me that something was not right with the policy when Ken Kennedy got suspended. Around that time, Ken was riding with another guy who was on the gas. Ken would call the guy in Florida he got his stuff from, and he would then hand the phone over to his buddy so he could put in his order. They ordered at the exact same time, got tested at the same time, but only Ken got suspended. Ken was floating around in the mid-card, the other guy was being groomed for the top. That right there told me that it wasn't the lab handing out the suspensions. The policy's there so the WWE can show Congress that they're doing it, but there's a huge double standard when it comes to the results. The guys who don't draw money are the ones who get suspended and made examples of. If any of the top guys get caught violating the policy, they get off light because they make money for the company. Undertaker and Flair refused point blank to take the test. They wouldn't do it. They told management they would sooner walk out. Triple H, John Cena and Batista all got tested. I can guarantee that because I stood in line with them, but I've got to question their results since they were the only ones who didn't shrink in size. Look at Chris Masters, he shrunk to about half his size when they brought steroid testing in. It didn't help that Hunter kept bringing attention to how Chris had shrunk and fucking with his head about it. That was pretty low if you ask me. Go look at the guys who didn't shrink once they brought in the testing. Top guys earning top money. Like many things, if you're able to throw money at a problem, you can usually find a way around it. One of the more famous Hardcore Holly incidents was when he showed up to the WWF's Tough Enough reality show and he legitimately beat up young trainee Matt Cappotelli. Here's what Holly had to say in his book. Matt Cappotelli happened to be there when I got in. I knocked him down in the corner and started stomping on him. As I've said a million times already, I work stiff but I don't set out to hurt people. But he was flailing around and trying to move. I wanted him to stay down but he was not following my lead. Anybody who wrestles know that if you're in the ring with someone more experienced than you go where he puts you and he controls what happens. Cappotelli should have known it too, but he still squirmed and he tried to get up. He ended up getting a boot in the mouth, which busted him open. The producers from MTV wanted Big to step in and stop the match, but he told them not to be stupid. I guess reality got too real for MTV. Sure, I got rough with him, I'll admit it, but I'm rough with everybody. I took it upon myself to teach him what wrestling's like. Wrestling is a rough business. I didn't bust his nose or do anything to him that hasn't been done to me, or that wouldn't be done to him at some point in his career. The next day, they filmed Matt Cappotelli crying like a fucking girl, saying he wanted to go home because he had been roughed up a little bit. He had a black eye and a busted lip. I can't tell you how many black eyes and busted lips I've had, and not once did I ever complain about it. Here was this kid on a show called Tough Enough and he was ready to go home because he got a little hurt. They ended up talking him into staying. They should have let him quit as far as I'm concerned. If he's going to go on TV and cry about me being rough with him, he had no business in wrestling. Years later, he ended up with a brain tumour and I felt really bad for him, but he never would have made it in the business. I know it because of the way he carried on after his run-in with me. He didn't think getting hurt was part of the business. Are you kidding me? I was there with cracked vertebrae and a shattered disc in my neck, about to go into surgery the next day, and I was in there teaching him how to work, getting on with it. He got a busted lip and wanted to quit the business. Wrestling was definitely not for him. This is quite a long story, but it's a good one. It's about Rene Dupree getting Holly into some legal trouble over a rental car. Here's what happened. It was the middle of 2004 and Rene was travelling with me for the first time. We'd been working house shows together, so we figured we'd ride together to the TV taping. This was around the time that bad hurricanes had been hitting, so I had to get back home. Before I left, Rene asked me if I could leave my rental car with him in Spokane. I told him that was fine as long as he made sure to fill the car up with gas before he returned it. A couple of months passed without incident. Bradshaw and I were on a layover in the Houston airport eating lunch when my mom called me to tell me that I'd gotten something in the mail from the City of Spokane District Court. When I was on the road, I had all my mail forwarded to her. She then told me that my driver's license had been suspended because of an unpaid parking ticket and there was a warrant for my arrest in Washington. I just about blew a gasket. As it happened, Rene was walking by just as I got off the phone, so I confronted him about it. He told me he didn't know what I was talking about and he had never got a parking ticket using my rental. He totally denied it. Both Bradshaw and I had a few choice words for him. I ended up having to fly to Spokane, and it cost me the flight and a whole weekend of missed work, including a TV taping. This wasn't cheap to take care of. Renee still denied it. Whenever I confronted him about it, he'd deny it and refuse to make it right. That really pissed me off, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. I gave him a little warning on the plane the day before I was planning to get even with him. I found I was sitting behind him, so I tapped him on the shoulder and told him, "You've got 24 hours to learn how to fight." 24 hours later, he still hadn't apologised. We were in New York, and the match was me and Charlie against Renee and Kenzo Suzuki. I started hitting Renee, laying it in and telling him to hit me back because we were fixing to go. He ran away from me, just took off backstage where he thought he'd be safe. I went after him and caught him, dropped him, and proceeded to beat the living shit out of him. Big Show grabbed me from behind and threw me off him, and Dave Finlay, who was an agent at that point, came over and said, "What the f***, Bob?" I said, "No, what the f***, Dave? You don't know?" I told him about the parking ticket situation. Dave responded he deserved to have his ass kicked. Holly had an odd relationship with Ken Kennedy where they didn't see eye to eye but then became friends. The relationship went downhill again though just before Holly left WWE. One night in Italy, we got back to the locker room and Ken didn't thank the guys in the match for putting him over. Thanking the guys who put you over is the very first thing you should do after a match because they just made you look good. I gave Ken several minutes to do this and nothing happened. I called him out in front of everybody. He said he would have gotten around to it. I told him you don't go and do whatever else first, you thank the people who put you over and shake their hands. The next night at another arena in Italy, when Ken came in, I marched right in, grabbed his bag and threw it in the hallway, saying, "Get the f*** out of my locker room, you're not changing in here until I say you can." A couple of days went by before Benoit came to talk to me. Kennedy had just started riding with him back in the States, so Chris knew a few things I didn't. He told me that Ken had just lost his dad. Chris knew Ken was going through a hard time, and he said he respected and supported my decision to throw Ken out of the locker room, but suggested that I should go and talk to him. I found him and said, "Why didn't you tell me about your dad?" Ken said he didn't feel like it was something he needed to tell people, but yeah, he was having a tough time. He started crying, and I felt bad for him, I really did. It broke my heart to see him crying like that. I told him to get his ass back in the locker room and apologise for upsetting him. From that moment on, we became good friends. In mid-2008, we were doing a show in Bakersfield, California. I needed some pain meds because my neck was hurting and I needed yet another elbow surgery. So I asked Ken if he had anything. He said sure and gave me some meds. He then said if I needed any more later, I should just go in his bag and get them. Later that day, I needed some more meds. I finished doing my pre-tape interview and went into the locker room. About 15 people were there. I grabbed another few pills from Ken's bag. He came in with Umaga moments later, so I told him I'd taken 4 pills and would replace them when I get my next prescription filled. He said that was fine and went about getting some pills for Umaga. I thought that was the end of it, but then, a week or so later, a rumour started floating around that I'd gone into Ken's bag without permission. I called him up at home to ask him what was up and he assured me that everything was fine. Next time I saw him on TV, I talked to him about this rumour again and he said he didn't know anything about how it started. In the end, I got a phone call from Johnny Laurinaitis asking me what was going on. I told him what had happened and he said that isn't what he had heard. I found out afterwards, through talking to John Cena and Shawn Michaels, the rumour had started when Umaga had told a couple of people that I'd gone into Ken's bag to get pills. Ken never told Umaga that he said that I could, and when the rumour started spreading, Ken could have stopped it by saying I told Bob it was okay, but he didn't. He'd been lying to me the whole time, claiming he didn't know what was going on and then not admitting that he hadn't squashed the rumour. It was self-preservation for Ken. Word had spread that I'd taken stuff from Ken's bag, and when the rumour reached management, Ken could have got in trouble, so he stooged me out. You don't stooge the boys out and you always try to help each other. Ken really kicked me when I was down. I told him a lot of things that were going on with me, with my divorce and everything. I needed him to be a friend and instead his actions could have serious implications for my career. I confronted Ken and called him every name under the sun. I even tried to get him to come outside and settle it with me, but he wouldn't. In mid-2002, Randy Orton started with WWE and they asked me to work with him in his TV debut. They knew he was a hothead, so they wanted me to test him. JR came to me and said, "We want you to beat the shit out of this kid, let's see what he's made of." I was super rough with him, he never complained. Look at him now, he's one of the best in the business. His attitude and temper did get him in trouble elsewhere though. He got pushed fast and started making money for the company, so he got away with a lot. He failed several drug tests but wasn't really reprimanded. I think he got suspended a couple of times, but nowhere near as many as he should have been. He probably should have been fired for his behaviour at times. He lost his temper so badly that he destroyed a 5-star hotel room, causing over $15,000 worth of damage. We were all in the banquet room waiting for another plane while Randy was off wrecking everything he could get his hands on. Triple H left his credit card with the desk and told him to charge the cost of repairs to him. Admittedly, I thought that was pretty damn noble. Do you think Randy got fired for his actions? Of course not. Look at Batista. Don't get me wrong, I like Dave, but when they started his huge push, he was one of the worst wrestlers to ever step into the ring and he couldn't talk either. A few of the boys have tried their hand at MMA when they got done with wrestling. Dave Batista had a great look for wrestling, but I wasn't sure how well MMA would work out for him. Once, when I was playing around with Dave in the ring before a show in Louisville, I tied his ass up. Kevin Fertig and a bunch of other boys saw this go down. Dave started panicking and yelling, "Let me go." Everyone laughed. He started in on Booker at another point and Booker knocked his ass out cold. I really like Dave, but I don't think MMA's for him. In his first match, he was lucky he won. He was on defense the whole time until he got a takedown. I don't know how far he's going to get in MMA because there's a difference between fighting some overweight guy and competing at the top level. Still, he said he was going to do it and he did it, so people need to get off his back. Melina and Batista had something going on when she was with John Morrison. John was an idiot for being okay with that. When he found out, he should have been a fucking man and whipped Batista's ass. John could have taken Batista in a fight for sure. He was just afraid he would lose his job because Batista was one of the top guys who was living in Hunter's colon. This is really just the tip of the iceberg. In the book, Holly also talks about Montreal, the injury sustained during his short feud with Brock Lesnar, how much he really hates women's wrestling, breaking into the WWF as Sparky Plug, and loads of other little tales about how much of a hard man Bob Holly really is. It's worth reading for sure, so do check it out when you get a chance. That's all from me, and hopefully you enjoyed this look into wrestling's ever lovable, squishy, tough guy, hardcore, bombastic Bob Sparky Holly. Thank you for watching, and please take care. Okay, like the Bob Holly video I uploaded recently, I wanted to dig into Ric Flair's book and pick out the juiciest bits. You all seem to get a kick out of Holly's book, so let's do the same for the Nature Boy. Granted, Flair won't have the same kind of stories as Holly and he might be a bit more reserved, but Rick still took a lot of shots in his book named To Be the Man. So let's look at what Slick Rick had to say about folks like Bret Hart, Mick Foley, Jim Herd and others. Again, all quotes are directly from Rick's book, but they'll also be abridged just to help the overall flow of the video. Ric Flair and Eric Bischoff didn't have a great relationship in WCW, and it really comes down to Flair feeling that Eric didn't respect him. You also get the feeling that Flair tried to fight against company evolution sometimes, and maybe Rick was stuck in his old ways. But let's hear what Rick had to say and you'll gain a better understanding. I helped Eric Bischoff get his job, recruited Hulk Hogan, allowed him to win the championship, then lost a retirement match. I just assumed Eric would take care of someone like that. He had to, I reassured myself. There was no way he would screw me. I caught a lot of heat for my relationship with Arn Anderson. I pushed for him to join the booking committee and make no apologies about it. Arn's the perfect guy for that position, though not everyone shared my opinion, and the friendship drove a wedge between Bischoff and myself. Once, when I suggested that Arn win the TV championship, Eric sneered, "You could roll Arn Anderson in shit and he wouldn't draw a fly." I could practically hear Hogan's voice coming out of Eric's mouth as he elaborated, "Arn's not colourful, he doesn't move merchandise." No matter what Bischoff claims, he used me to get Hogan and Savage. After that, I was a bit player to him, and I heard that he blamed me for decisions I didn't even make. When I was on the booking committee, Arn was asked to cancel a planned vacation and tour Japan. Why? Because Eric told Arn, "Flair wants you to." Ron Simmons, later known to WWE fans as Farouk, was led to believe that I didn't perceive him as a championship caliber performer. Bullshit, it was Hogan who didn't want to work with Simmons. Eric also seemed to take pleasure in demeaning me in front of the boys. Before a match with Bret Hitman Hart, Bischoff walked up to me in front of a group of people and said, "In your match with Bret tonight, I want the sharpshooter. Get it done in 20 minutes. Then he walked away. The prick acted like he was talking to a guy at the bottom of the card. Once, when I questioned why he was having me lose to Conan, he shouted at me in the dressing room hallway, "Why are you always complaining about something? Just fucking do what we write down. This is a team. This isn't about you anymore, Rick." On July 15th, 2002, Vince brought Bischoff into WWE, playing off their long-standing business rivalry. Eric was strictly a character in the storylines, with no backstage stroke whatsoever. When I saw Bischoff walk through the dressing room at the Continental Airlines Arena in New Jersey, my heart sank. I had 1,000 reasons for never punching out Eric Bischoff in WCW. He was an executive. I had dragged my family through one lawsuit and didn't want to get caught up in another. Now that he was in WWE as a performer, no different than me or anyone else, I finally had my chance. On March 17th, 2003, before a broadcast of Raw, I went in the catering and asked Arn Anderson if I could speak with him. He followed me into the hallway and I said, "Please just watch the door." He had no idea what I was talking about. I returned to the dressing room and approached Bischoff. "I need to talk to you," I said. He held up one finger so I would wait, but I had already waited too long. I slapped him hard across the face, knocking the cell phone out of his hand. He began backing up. I swung at him 3 times, but couldn't connect because he was moving so fast. When Bischoff got to the wall, I pushed him onto a couch, climbed on top of him, pressed my finger against his eye, and said, "I could take your fucking eye out right now." I could have also used my fist to bust open his face while he was cowering underneath me, but that wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted him to get up and fight. I backed away so he could get up from the couch. "Let's go, right now," I yelled. I swung my leg around and kicked the back of his leg, hoping it would jar him out of his seat. "I'm not going to fight you," he said, but I wasn't going to give him a choice. Suddenly, Sergeant Slaughter, who's now a WWE road agent, was standing between us. "Rick, what are you doing?" he asked. "Just paying a debt," I told him. Personally, I'm sure that Slaughter would have just as soon pulled me off a bloody Bischoff and separated us. But Vince doesn't want his agents to lose control of the dressing room, so I let Slaughter lead me away. Vince already knew my history with Bischoff and didn't need elaboration. "Rick, this is unprofessional," he hesitated, then asked, "Was this planned? Was anybody else involved?" He suspected that Arn and I conspired to set up Bischoff. "No," I answered honestly. "I asked Arn to watch the door, that was it." Vince shook his head. "This cannot happen again. When you're in the arena, you're on company property as far as I'm concerned." I nodded. "One more thing, Rick. Is there anybody else you're planning to do this to?" "Yeah, Hogan." I said this half jokingly, although I was still mad about him whipping David back in WCW. Vince's eyes practically bugged out. "My God, please don't do that." The franchise Shane Douglas mentioned Ric Flair a lot while working in ECW, stating that Rick held him down when Shane worked in the company. Rick expands on this further in his book while also sharing his personal feelings towards the franchise. On the same night that Eric returned to Nitro, I was booked in a match against Shane Douglas, a guy I remembered for his long, moronic monologues in ECW, calling me Dick Flair and claiming that I'd held him back in WCW during the Jim Herd era. Douglas had also gone on the internet, psychoanalyzing me as an aging, insecure hack who couldn't handle working in the same company as a guy with his youth and looks. But when we finally met in WCW, he told me all the stuff I was saying was just a work. I was really hoping that we'd get to wrestle each other one day. This is a man who failed on every level. Remember Dean Douglas, his character in the World Wrestling Federation? You probably don't, because he was absolutely forgettable. According to him though, that was Vince McMahon's fault. In his mind, someone was always holding him back. Well, let me tell you something, if you're good in this business, you'll figure out a way to show it to people. If you're great, it will eventually come out. Dean Douglas was neither good nor great. He was never a star of any significance. I've made more people than Shane Douglas ever entertained in his life. Mick Foley took a few shots at Rick in his first book, named Have a Nice Day. The book sold incredibly well, and in my opinion, it was Mick's best book. But Flair felt Mick went too far, and he wanted to offer a rebuttal. Foley stated that Flair booked him poorly when Mick worked in WCW, and here's what Rick had to say about that. When I first started on the booking committee, Mick Foley was working as Cactus Jack and doing an angle where he was living in a homeless shelter. I admit it, I didn't know what to do with a £300 guy living in a homeless shelter. It took P.T. Barnum, in the form of Vince McMahon, to take a guy whose claim to fame was his willingness to get thrown off a cage, turn him into mankind, and make him into a champion. Foley had a cult following because of his contribution to hardcore wrestling, but hardcore is such a small part of the history of this business. When I was training, falling off a ladder was not a prerequisite to making it as a professional wrestler. Being fundamentally sound was. Occasionally, staying inside of a gym was. I don't care how many thumbtacks Mick Foley's fallen on, how many ladders he's fallen off, how many continents he's supposedly bled on. He'll always be known as a glorified stuntman. Vern Gagne didn't fall off a ladder, Dory Funk Jr. didn't fall off a ladder, neither did Wahoo, Steamboat or Steve Austin. Terry Funk was a great worker before he started doing that. Kurt Angle, Shawn Michaels and Chris Jericho can do it and maintain their reputations because they're already respected as athletes. And what about other people who never did anything else, like the Sandman? He's no wrestler. Hardcore became a niche for a lot of guys who couldn't do f*** all in the ring. I'm not saying that Mick Foley wasn't a star, that he wasn't a great attraction, but in my estimation, Mick Foley was not a great worker. He couldn't punch, he couldn't kick. In the World Wrestling Federation, he'd spend half the day before television broadcasts sucking up to the writers because he's such a fan of himself. There's a difference between being a great performer and being a guy like Brutus Beefcake or the Ultimate Warrior, who became famous because he happened to be working for Vince. It's the same for Foley. When he hasn't been working for Vince, there's been no demand for him whatsoever. He's just another guy. Bret Hart. It's hard to tell what these two truly feel about each other. One minute they're throwing jabs, the next they seem to be best friends. Bret even showed up for Rick's ill-fated final match in 2022. When Rick wrote his book though, he didn't think much of the Hitman. Personally, I never saw dollar signs on Bret Hart. He was a good, sound, physical wrestler, but with limited charisma and interview skills. He also could have been the president of his own fan club. Bret truly thought he was the best technical wrestler who ever lived, and he was stuck in a routine that he refused to break. When he'd make his comeback, he'd rely on the same sequence of moves, and I'm just going to stop here and say this is very rich coming from Ric Flair, but let's continue on. The same sequence of moves: an atomic drop, a clothesline, a gut punch, a Russian leg sweep, a backbreaker, a fist drop from the second rope, and finally his finisher, the sharpshooter. Night after night with no variation. Come on, Rick. Every well-known wrestler has patented things that he does in his matches, but you can still entertain your fans by putting those things in different spots or doing them in different ways. If I tried adding things to Bret's comeback, like hitting him with a chop, he couldn't stand it. It had to be in rotation. Don't get me wrong, Bret could have a tremendous match when it really counted, but day to day, I found him to be inflexible. And in 1997, when Bret punched out Vince over a finish in Montreal, I was appalled. Bret refused to lose in Canada. That would be the equivalent of me saying I'd never let anyone beat me in North Carolina. Give me a break. Obviously, Vince could see that Hart thought he was bigger than the World Wrestling Federation, and Vince did what was necessary to protect his company. When Shawn Michaels put the Hitman in a sharpshooter, McMahon ordered the timekeeper to ring the bell. The match was over, Vince said, and Shawn was the new champion. When people argued that Vince had screwed Bret, McMahon accurately replied, Bret screwed Bret. The facts are this: Hogan, for all he did, right and wrong, drew a lot of money. Savage, for all he did, right and wrong, drew a lot of money. Roddy Piper, Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair drew big money. Bret Hart did not. Vince had other distractions at the time, but when Bret beat me for the title, the company went to hell for a while. Flair spoke ill of Sid Vicious both in his book and in the Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen WWE DVD that was released back in 2007. Flair didn't think that Sid should have been a member of the Four Horsemen, and according to his book, he didn't think he was worth the money he was being paid. I never did anything but produce, and yet when it came to renew my contract, the company tried to cut my salary. Their plan was to phase me out of main events and scale back the number of my dates. Instead of the $730k I'd been receiving, I was offered a deal where I'd make $350k for 2 consecutive years, then $250k for the last year of the agreement. That's $900,000 over 3 years, as opposed to the $1.2 million a year for Sid Udy, a useless musclehead who, under the names Sid Vicious, Sid Justice and Psycho Sid, would bounce back and forth between WCW and the World Wrestling Federation, contributing zero to either company. Sid exemplifies the worst of this business. He got rich despite never learning his craft or drawing a dime. On December 27, 1993, Vader was supposed to lose his WCW Championship to Sid at Starrcade. As I mentioned previously, aside from his imposing physique, Sid offered nothing to the business. He didn't want to learn how to perform or build up to execute an exciting match. On more than one occasion, he claimed to be injured or sick, but managed to play in a softball league. Still, promoters kept throwing money at him because of his monster look. During a booking meeting in the Jim Herd days, Jim Cornette raised a reasonable objection to placing Sid in a prominent role on an upcoming show. We have to go back to that town someday. Jim Herd served as WCW's executive vice president from 1988 to 1992, and he had some pretty outlandish ideas. He and Rick butted heads a lot because Rick's a traditionalist, while Jim's, in Rick's words, he's an idiot. Jim Herd was an idiot. This is not defamation, I'm just telling you history. The man had no right to be anywhere near a wrestling company. Herd worked as an executive for a bank, then for Pizza Hut. Around the boys, Herd, a gruff, white-haired guy, liked to curse and talk about how tough he had been during his days as a Navy boxer. To us, he was just the Pizza King, the name the wrestlers called him behind his back. Because I was on the booking committee, some people had the false impression that I made all the big decisions in WCW at this time. The truth is that Herd ran the committee and we had rotating members, including Jim Ross, Jody Hamilton, Terry Funk, Jim Barnett, Kevin Sullivan and Jim Cornette, who Herd hated. With the territories gone, there were very few places for Jim Ross to go, and here he was, with all his knowledge, having to go out at night and pour gins for that ignorant bastard. It was a matter of self-preservation. Herd's gimmicks are legendary. Matt Bourne, a guy who'd later convincingly give life to the character of Doink the Clown in the WWF, was Big Josh, a lumberjack who hung around with dancing bears. Then there were the Ding Dongs, a masked tag team with bells hanging from their costumes. Whenever they made the tag, they rang a bell in their corner. Had he not been stopped, Herd would have also brought in the Hunchbacks, a team that was unbeatable because their shoulders couldn't touch the canvas. During one meeting, Kevin Sullivan started kidding Herd about the Hunchbacks concept. "I know what we can do," he said. "We'll throw them outside the ring, get a shovel, dig a hole, put the hump in it, and cover 1, 2, 3. "Great idea," Herd replied. The asshole was serious too. In Herd's mind, he could transform me into a character that could compete with Vince's characters. When I talk about it now, people laugh. At the time though, it was very upsetting. "My robe was outdated," he said, "and I needed a new look. I never became Spartacus and refused to wear the earring, but I let Herd talk me into cutting my hair, and I hated myself for it. I don't think the fans liked it either. I didn't look like Ric Flair. I'd spent all these years putting up with shit, sacrificing my body and never seeing my oldest kids, to find myself manipulated by the whims of a moron, a fucking pizza company executive with his finger on the trigger. This is the kind of shit that I was putting up with, despite the fact that I was on the booking committee. That's why it pissed me off when Mick Foley blamed me for not recognising his full potential during that period. In his book, Have a Nice Day, Foley wrote, "Ric Flair was every bit as bad on the booking side of things as he was great on the wrestling side of it." From what I've been told, the Steiners had a falling out after Scott decided to leave Rick behind and become a singles star. As a singles performer, Scott had a tendency to go on the microphone and start ripping into people in a personal way. He did it to Diamond Dallas Page and his wife Kimberly, Tori Wilson and Terry Taylor. But he always seemed to avoid insulting Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Haku, Scott Norton, and other guys who might have had a rebuttal. On February 7, 2000, Scott went on TV and greeted the end of my sabbatical with an idiotic diatribe, mentioning how WCW would have been better off hiring the late Buddy Rogers than Nature Boy number 2 Ric Flair, then addressing me directly. When you walked down the aisle last week, the people at home, all they did was grab their remote and change their channel to the World Wrestling Federation and watch Stone Cold, a person who you and your friends got fired from here, cause you're a jealous old bastard. So Ric Flair, remember this, there's never been a bigger ass-kissing bastard in the business, but also in life. You belong where you're at in WCW, cause WCW sucks. I don't know what possessed Steiner to do that so-called shoot interview. Yeah, WCW sucked, but it wasn't smart to advertise that on your own show. And whose ass did I kiss? Jim Herd's? Bischoff's? What the hell was this guy talking about? The most upsetting thing about his comments was that Steiner said I played a role in having Austin fired from WCW. Hell, I knew, and I hoped Austin did too, that I was one of his biggest advocates. At the time of the speech, Steiner didn't have any kids. I did. And after hearing Scott's interview, they asked me, what was that all about? The answer is that I'm not even sure Steiner understood what he was saying. He was irrational. Lex Luger told me that when the topic came up, Scott told him, yeah, Flair really screwed you around. Screwed Luger around? This guy didn't have the facts. If I did anything for Luger, it was make his career. Today, Scott Steiner has a family, and the sad thing is that they're now going to have to read what I'm saying about him, the same way my kids had to listen to what he said about me. At one time, Scott was a decent athlete. After a number of injuries, though, he's a shadow of his former self. He took a cheap shot that I'll never understand and certainly didn't deserve. He's a guy who meant nothing as an attraction, he drew no money and has no legacy. People will forget him the minute he retires. Most wrestling fans have already forgotten him. He's mid-card talent now. Vince Russo needs no introduction. You guys know who he is, and even without reading Rick's book, you'd be able to easily guess how the traditional Ric Flair would feel about Russo's creative philosophies. Russo had a lot of ideas, and the balls to barge past Vince McMahon's inner circle and pitch things personally to the boss. Soon, Russo wasn't writing about wrestling anymore, he was actually helping McMahon come up with storylines and plot twists. When Russo finally arrived, I watched all the guys walk up to him, one by one. He never said a word to me, and I certainly wasn't going to get in line to kiss his ass. To hear him speak, you'd imagine that he was solely responsible for the World Wrestling Federation's recent success. Russo was no Vince McMahon, and he was no Paul Heyman either. Heyman's another crazy wrestling fan who grew up in the New York area and ended up becoming a significant character in the business. When Heyman ran ECW, he had a vision and acted on it. Did I like all that hardcore stuff he did? No. But Heyman paid his dues through the ups and downs of his company and had influence on other promotions. In his own way, he is a genius. Initially, Russo told everybody that he didn't want to be on TV. Pretty soon, however, he had himself on camera playing a bad guy, interfering in matches, and giving long speeches about his brilliant wrestling mind. The guy wasn't brilliant, he was obsessed with making himself a star. On camera, Russo had David and Stacey play up to their real-life romance. He wanted to have them marry, only to discover that Stacey was my love child. He also considered doing a storyline in which David would find out that he was actually Russo's son. It seemed like whenever Russo had a hole in the show, he'd try to plug it with something involving my family. You know how other guys go to fantasy camps with ex-players from their favourite baseball teams? Well, Russo outdid them all on June 5, 2000, when he had a cage match with one of his favourite wrestlers, Ric Flair. I put Russo in the figure 4, I held him there, and kept holding him there as fans waited for something to happen. Sensing their agitation, I looked upward about 150 feet to the catwalk, where stunt coordinator Ellis Edwards was sitting with a pressurised drum filled with 75 gallons of blood. He couldn't press the release mechanism to drop it on us, though, until Russo was directly over most of the WCW logo on the mat, otherwise we'd have to roll into the blood. Somehow we repositioned our bodies and the blood came streaming down. What was the point of all this? I can't tell you. All I know is that a similar situation had taken place while Russo was in the World Wrestling Federation, and he tended to rely on ideas that had previously worked over there. Once I was drenched, my son David placed me in his own figure 4, setting me up to be pinned by Russo. With everything that I'd accomplished throughout my career, this is what it had come to at 51 years of age. Do you know how it felt, lying there on the canvas with fake blood splattered all over me, losing to a magazine writer? You figure it out. After so many spectacular years in the business, I didn't know where I ranked anymore. Fans too young to have witnessed my matches with Harley and Steamboat would now live the rest of their lives with memories of me in a mental hospital, being buried in the desert, and having my head shaved by Vince Russo. It seemed to me like my legacy had been destroyed. Again, Rick expands a lot more in his book and everything's a lot more fleshed out. So if you want to learn a bit more, pick up the book or remember to look it up next time you're sailing the 7 seas. I won't judge. What you also have to keep in mind is that some of this stuff is retconned by now, and Flair probably feels different about a lot of these people because, let's be honest, Slick Rick seems to change his tune quite frequently, and he was so deep in the wrestling business that I think even he didn't know when he was working or shooting. But that'll do it for today, and if you can think of any other books you want me to check out for the juicy bits, then let me know. I'm currently trying to get through Diana Hart's book, which is, it's a bit mental, but I'll follow up on that very soon. Thanks for watching everyone, I do appreciate it, and please take care. What I've learned from putting these videos together to take the juiciest bits from a wrestler's autobiography, either you guys really like controversial takes, or you don't like reading books. Either way, I'm happy to present another one of these videos to you guys because you seem to really like them. So let's check out the tome that is Bret Hart's autobiography. I actually read this book twice, God love me. Once when it was first released, and then again a few years later when I wanted to research something but ended up getting sucked right back in. It's such an extensive book that it's hard to remember little bits and pieces, but all you really gotta do is search up some keywords and you'll get what you're looking for. You should be happy to know that I've completely left out Montreal here because I think we all know what Bret had to say about it. And I've also seriously condensed the HBK and Kliq stuff to a single section because, again, I think everyone already knows what Bret thought about Shawn and his group. So, let's get started. From reading Bret's book, you quickly learn that the Hitman once considered Hogan a good friend. He kinda looked up to Hulk even though he didn't think much of his in-ring work from bell to bell. It all went downhill though in 1993 during WrestleMania 9. When I read my booking sheets, I realised I'd see Hulk Hogan at TVs in North Charleston, South Carolina on March 8th. Even though he'd been making the odd appearance on various shows since December 92, I hadn't laid eyes on him since WrestleMania 8. I really thought he'd be proud of me, so when I pulled up to the back of the arena, I went looking for him. I didn't have to look far, he was standing chatting with Beefcake, leaning against the wall on the ramp. His appearance had changed drastically, he looked like a lean old walrus. He was tanned and wore red spandex tights, big white boots, and a bandana covering his balding head. I approached him with a huge smile and my hand extended in friendship. Hogan gave me a dismissive nod and wouldn't shake my hand. I figured that because I was champion now, he saw me as the competition. Hulkamania had run so wild that it had burned itself out like a grass fire, and here I was, one of the new brightly coloured flowers popping up to haunt him. On April 2nd, 93, I brought Stu and Helen with me to Vegas for WrestleMania 9, where my mum was also going to have a family reunion with her 4 sisters. I left them to reminisce and went to my room just in time to answer a call from Vince, who asked me to come to his suite to talk. I knocked on his door and he answered it with that goofy grin. We sat down and Vince said, "This is what I want you to do. I want you to drop the belt to Yoko tomorrow." I sat there dumbstruck as he went on to explain how Fuji would screw me by throwing salt in my face, blinding me. After Yoko was handed the belt, Hogan would rush to my aid, and in some kind of roundabout way, Hogan would end up winning the belt from Yoko right then and there. Like I was handing Vince my sword, I told him I appreciated everything he did for me and I'd do whatever he wanted. Vince said, "Don't get bitter, I still have big plans for you." Soundbites flashed through my mind of Vince assuring me that I was the long-term champion and not to worry about Hogan, who still hadn't even spoken to me yet. As I stood up to leave, I asked, "Did you take the belt from me because I didn't do a good enough job?" "Of course not, I'm just going in a different direction. It's still onwards and upwards for you. Nothing's going to change too much for you." I was totally crushed. By the time I got to the dressing room the following afternoon, word that I was losing the title had leaked out to the boys. Most of them were quiet and some were angry. The Nasty Boys, Shawn, Taker and several others expressed their utter disappointment. Hulk arrived with his entourage, his wife, manager, Beefcake and Jimmy Hart. Clearly he'd been in the know all along, probably from the first day he came back. Now he was suddenly acting like my long lost old pal and wearing a big smile that rightfully belonged to me. During the match, as scripted, with my face buried in the crook of my arm, I waved to him to avenge my loss. Go get him, Hulk. I was really thinking, go ahead Hogan, take from me what I worked so hard to get. We'll see how long you last. Hogan was champion again without even having a match, and before I'd even made it backstage. A few minutes later, Hogan came up to me excited and happy and said, "Thank you brother, I won't forget it. I'll be happy to return the favour." I looked my old friend in the eye and said, "I'm gonna remember that, Terry." As soon as Hogan had taken the belt back, house show attendance nosedived. WWF wrestlers were paid a percentage of the gate, and it made me feel good when most of the boys told me they hoped I'd get the belt back. On May 29th, Vince called me at home to tell me the big news that I was getting the belt back. What I didn't expect to hear was that he was getting ready to call Hogan, and he hated the thought of telling him that he was too old and tired for a company whose marketing strategy was now based around a new generation concept. 10 days later, Vince called again. He warned me that he was about to tell me something that would make me really angry. Hogan was flat out refusing to put me over, saying I wasn't in his league. Vince had decided that Yoko would be getting the belt instead. I couldn't believe that Hogan would do this to me. I remembered him shaking my hand at WrestleMania 9 and telling me he'd be happy to return the favour. Vince said he'd have one more meeting with Hogan to try to sell him on it, but if he didn't go for it, I'd be working with Lawler at SummerSlam instead. Hogan didn't go for it. I wanted to believe that Vince hadn't told me the whole story, and I made up my mind to confront Hogan as soon as he dropped the belt to Yoko. I'd wait till then, because it didn't seem right to me to change Yoko's destiny. I showed up to the dressing room for King of the Ring in a dark mood, and promptly drew a blackboard cartoon of Beefcake with his head buried in Hogan's ass cheeks with a caption that read, "Be careful Brutus, you don't want to loosen the screws in your face." Speaking of screws. I was taking out my frustration on Beefcake, which wasn't right, but I was too pissed off to know it at the time. I went backstage and watched Hogan and Yoko on a monitor. They moved in slow motion like a walrus squaring off against a hippopotamus. I rolled my eyes at how lame the finish was. Once Hogan got back to his dressing room, I knocked on the door and stepped in. I said, "Terry, I want to speak with you." We stared at each other. You told me at WrestleMania 9 that you'd be happy to return the favour, and as I understand it, now you don't want to even work with me. You won't put me over, and I'm not in your league. Hogan stood there speechless, so I carried on. Well, you're right, you're not in my league. On behalf of myself, my family, and most of the boys in the dressing room, you can go f*** yourself. He stuttered, "Brother, you don't know the whole story." I got the story directly from Vince. I said, "Terry, you haven't said 10 words to me since you got back almost 4 months ago. If you want to level with me, then go ahead, I'm right here." "I can't." "Why not?" "Because you told me to go f*** myself." "That's right, and I'll tell you again, go f*** yourself." I turned and walked out, heading straight for the ring to wrestle Bam Bam Bigelow for the main event finale of the tournament. Vince pulled me aside to lecture me about how it was unprofessional of me to tell Hogan off. In fact, of the three of us, I felt that I was the only one who was being professional. Davey Boy Smith may be a member of the Hart family, but Bret makes it clear in his book that he was disappointed with Davey on more than one occasion. SummerSlam 92 sticks out because Bret and Davey had such a great match, but behind the scenes, things were spiralling out of control for the British Bulldog. It was official, SummerSlam 92 would be at Wembley Stadium in London. Davey was back on the road, and Vince was going with my idea to drop the IC belt to him. As the summer slipped away, I constantly phoned Davey down in Florida, but all Diana could tell me was that he was out with Jim Neidhart somewhere. I finally tracked Jim down just hours before I was leaving for England, and was shocked when he told me that he had just taken Davey and Diana to the airport. Davey was high as a kite when he caught his flight, Jim said, because he'd been up all night smoking crack with him. Jim told me that Davey had a grill on his back and he was worried about him. I wish Jim would take a good look at himself. I couldn't have been more disappointed in Davey and feared he would end up making us both look bad. I set out to find Davey, but he was off somewhere with Diana and his family. I didn't see him until the required entrance rehearsal at Wembley Stadium the night before the show. When I asked him why he hadn't returned my calls all summer, he wasn't able to look at me in the eye. He fessed up that he had been smoking crack with Jim for weeks and was now terrified. He had gone back to being that same helpless kid I rescued from the Dynamite Kid 10 years earlier. Trust me, Davey, and I'll do all I can to get you through tomorrow, okay? He nodded, and I set him down for a crash course, going over and over our match and making him recite the moves back to me. It was now completely up to me to save our match. At first, Davey outmaneuvered me with simple and realistic wrestling, but after only a few minutes, he was breathing hard. "Bret, I'm fucked," Davey panted as I had him clamped in a side headlock. "I can't remember anything." "Davey, just listen to me and I'll carry you." So that's how it was, me calling out every single high spot for Davey, sometimes even the necessary facial expressions, helping him conserve what little stamina he had for a comeback that was still more than 30 minutes away. Every time Davey picked me up, I went up like a feather, he went up like a full refrigerator. At the end of the match, I made out that I was too pissed off to shake Davey's hand. I'd planned all this with Davey, but it became painfully obvious to me that he had forgotten all about it. I desperately tried to make eye contact, but he was oblivious as Diana climbed into the ring crying. I can only assume for real. I'm thinking, come on Davey, look at me and we'll make them all cry. But Davey never caught on. Instead, he was trying to milk the crowd. I was thinking, the drama's with me, not them. For f***'s sake, please look at me, Davey. After too many attempts, I gave up and just walked over and shook his hand. He had completely missed one of the tiny moments that can make it all more real. But what could I do? The torch had been passed. We heard what Ric Flair had to say about Bret in the Nature Boys book, To Be the Man. Bret's book was released after the Nature Boys, so Hart already knew what Slick Rick said about him. Basically, Flair said he didn't think Bret was a draw, and he didn't see Bret as a top player in the wacky world of professional wrestling. The Observer often raved about Flair being the best in the business. I'd never seen him work because it was impossible to follow the rival TV show on my schedule. Steamboat, Piper and Harley, among others, all had great regard for Flair as a worker. I would face Flair for the first time at the New Havens TV on November 13th, and I was looking forward to finding out whether he was the best worker in the business, as all the marks and wrestling commentators generally declared. Flair was what my dad called a routine man, because he did the same match every night no matter who he worked with. He also liked to call every step of the match with little input from me. When we talked before the match, he had suggested a finish that called for me doing a flying tackle where he'd catch me and stagger backwards with the two of us toppling over the top rope only to be counted out for the finish, which would be a double DQ. It was a simple move that I'd done countless times with less skilled wrestlers, but at the end of the match, when I dove into Flair, he stood too far from the ropes, mistimed it, and didn't have the strength to catch me, so we fell down in a heap. I'm just going to cut in here and say I watched this whole match. You're seeing video and pictures of it right now, and I don't know what Bret's talking about here. It didn't happen. Maybe that part was cut out for its inclusion in the Invasion 1992 VHS, but I'm not sure what Bret's talking about. Anyway, on the spot, Rick came up with a makeshift finish that, not surprisingly, benefited him and not me. I wasn't going to make a big deal out of it, but back in the dressing room, I was annoyed to hear Flair crying to me about what happened on the finish, implying that I had screwed up. He showed me right then and there that he wasn't as great as he was supposed to be. I'd heard there were a lot of wrestlers who didn't trust or like Flair, and I was starting to see why. Soon enough, I was launched on return bouts with Flair, who seemed bent on sabotaging our matches. I wasn't sure if he was doing it accidentally or on purpose, but he was never there for me on my comeback and seemed to bungle the finish every night. I began to refer to Rick's ring style as full blast, non-stop, non-psychology. He made things up on the spot and did them whether they made sense or not. As a technician, Flair was one of the best, but I was baffled by how little he really knew about building a great match, and I was even more baffled by how this went undetected by fans and sheet riders who continued to worship him. The death of Bret's younger brother Owen's covered extensively in Bret's book, and it's all quite harrowing. From the accident itself all the way to the Hart family becoming completely divided over a potential lawsuit against the WWF. Bret felt that some of his family members were being easily manipulated by Vince McMahon. He thought many of his family members were sucking up to Vince after the incident in hopes of getting money or even a job. And I highly recommend you check the book out yourself if you want to learn more. Owen's death almost completely destroyed the Hart family, and in the centre of it all were Owen's widow Martha and Vince McMahon. Here's a snippet. Leaving the media circus at Hart House, I drove over to see Martha. I was amazed by her composure. She had already called a lawyer friend of hers by the name of Pam Fisher to seek legal advice. I watched the news with Martha, and there, on camera, was Davey, looking much better than he had in a long while. I couldn't believe it when Davey said that Owen's death was just an accident and that it was nobody's fault. Who was Davey to say whose fault it was when the police were still investigating what had happened? Davey then vowed he had returned to the WWF to win a title in Owen's honour. I did Good Morning America at 4 AM Calgary time in Stu's living room with Martha and my parents. I arrived unshaven and weary. Martha's lawyers were there to guard against anything being said that could jeopardise her legal standing with the WWF, so I focused on how the business had strayed too far from the premise of two athletes telling a story using only their bodies. Pro wrestling had become a can you top this rating war of increasingly more dangerous stunts and sleazy storylines. Owen was no stuntman, and clearly someone didn't know what they were doing. A union of wrestlers was long overdue, I said. At least if we had one, there'd be guidelines to distinguish between wrestling and stunt work, and there would be protection when someone got hurt. Meanwhile, Vince left me numerous phone messages pleading with me to call him back. I told Vince that I didn't appreciate that they went on with the show after Owen died. He replied that nobody knew what to do, they were so shocked, and they were afraid the fans might riot if he stopped the show. That struck me as ridiculous, and I said that if Shane had been dropped from the ceiling, Vince would have stopped it fast. He simply said, "We didn't know what to do." I didn't appreciate them airing a replay for profit either, and I didn't like watching Raw the day after Owen's death, when wrestlers sick with grief were given no choice about pouring their hearts out on live TV for ratings. I said a more fitting tribute to Owen would have been to celebrate his career by showcasing his matches. Then I sighed and told Vince that this never would have happened to Owen if I'd been there. Owen always came to me for advice, and I would have shot such a stupid idea down fast. It's no secret that Bret didn't enjoy his time in WCW, and the vast majority of fans didn't like Bret's run in the company either. Honestly, through reliving the war, I found a new appreciation for Bret's WCW work, and while it really doesn't compare to his WWF run, there's still a few gems to be found from the Hitman's time in Atlanta. The general consensus though is that it was a bad time for Bret, and Bret thought the same. On my first visit to WCW offices in Atlanta on December 14th, I bumped into Hogan, Macho and Eric Bischoff, who smiled confidently at me as he said, "If you think you're a big star now, you're going to be an even bigger star when I'm done with you." Hogan said what had happened between him and me before he left WWF was all Vince's fault. He said that Vince had bragged to him that he loved to ride the boys into the ground, then cook them and eat them. The truth was that Hogan didn't put me over when he had the chance for his own reasons. Because we needed to work together, however, I shook his hand when he offered it and told him I was sorry for anything I said about him after he left the WWF. He grinned back like I was an old friend. He also surprised me by giving me a compliment. He said he thought I was the best interview in the business now, even though I knew that honour really belonged to Stone Cold. In the face of relentless competition from Vince, Eric Bischoff seemed to be burning out in 1998, and as a result, the disorganisation at the WCW was getting worse. Vince's Shock TV pushed the envelope of what the censors would allow, and Bischoff looked more lost and confused every day. He had to put out a product that fit within Ted Turner's squeaky clean guidelines, and Vince knew it. Maybe it's a good thing that Eric couldn't go that way, even if he wanted to. I liked Eric and often offered him ideas. I don't know if it was pride or politics that made him shoot them down one by one. His own angles rarely made sense. They'd fly me to TV, paying for first-class airfare, hotel and a luxury car, only to leave me off the show. At the end of the day, in the WWF I got screwed for money, while in WCW I got paid well enough for so little output that I felt a bit too much like a whore. Vince Russo's a weird subject when it comes to Bret Hart. As you'll soon find out, Hart wasn't happy with Russo's plans for Owen at Over the Edge 99. But then you've got the Russo and Bret relationship in WCW, where Vince booked Bret to win the WCW Championship, something that Hogan and Bischoff flat out refused to do. Russo stated that the very first thing he wanted to do was bring Bret back to the main event scene, and to his credit, he did just that. But Bret doesn't care much when it comes to Russo. He doesn't care for him a single bit, actually. It was Russo who'd come up with the idea for the Blue Blazer to descend from the rafters in Kansas City. As soon as Owen landed in the ring, he was supposed to trip and fall as a spoof on wrestling superheroes. That's why there had been no safety line. Owen had to release himself quickly so he could deliver Russo's prop fall. I'm not laying blame here. It's punishment enough that Russo has to live with the knowledge of his role in Owen's death. At WCW, we were hanging on for dear life trying to put over Vince Russo's weird storylines. Russo thought his storylines had a lot to do with the WWF's rise in the ratings war, but he didn't get, and never would, that the best wrestling needed at least to pretend to be real. He had grand plans for me as a heel. I told him that the sympathy factor for me was too strong to pull off a heel turn, not to mention that I'd been turned so many times already. He still wanted to do this big angle on Nitro where I turned on Goldberg the day after Starrcade 99 in Toronto. I hated it all, but I was so angry at McMahon that I hoped Russo could bring the company back to life with his radical soap opera booking. Again, we all know how Bret feels about Goldberg. You can look this up and get many quotes from the Hitman that range from downright funny to downright vicious. Bret's book was written at a time when a lot of his negativity towards Bill hadn't festered yet, but it's still really grim reading about before Starrcade 99 and after Starrcade 99. I was also impressed with the look of Bill Goldberg, a muscle-packed former NFLer who went simply by his last name. Goldberg was bald-headed with an angry face punctuated by a goatee. All he needed to be intimidating was simple black trunks and low-cut black boots. He made his entrance to dramatic marching music, pausing just long enough to pound his chest in a haze of billowing smoke. He was destined to be WCW's new weapon in the battle of supremacy against Vince. Unfortunately, Bill was green and was injuring a lot of guys too. I kept working as many house shows as I could because I wanted to whittle down the number of days I was required to work in order to have more time off in the summer. I worked some house shows with Goldberg down south in Alabama and Florida. Goldberg was no fun. Every night he mowed me down with his full contact spear tackle, only to have Razor, Nash and Sid run in for the DQ to save the belt for me. Starrcade 99 came on December 19th, 99 at the MCI Centre in Washington DC. I sat on my bench strapping on my knee brace, wrapping my battered wrists and knees. My ribs were sore from Goldberg spearing me. They'd been tender for at least 10 years, ever since Dino Bravo knocked me into that steel fence back in 1989. I stretched and paced as I waited for my match with Goldberg. "Whatever you do out there, Bill, don't hurt me," I said. I really wanted this to be a great match. On Thursday, January 13, I sat in Dr. Mewis's office in Calgary, telling him about Goldberg's ferocious kick to my neck while he felt around with his fingers. He noticed that I was slurring my words and asked if I thought I had a concussion. I told him maybe a slight one. He probed me with questions and then recited some numbers and asked me to repeat them back to him backwards. I couldn't. Then he gave me 5 random words that he had asked me to remember in a few minutes. I couldn't. He studied me, then asked me again if I thought I had a concussion. I told him again, a slight one. "I can feel a hole in the back of your neck the size of a quarter." He felt around the back of my skull. "This part here feels like a hamburger." "I have a pay-per-view on Sunday. I'm in the main event." With a dry smile, he said, "You're not going anywhere. The problem with people that have concussions is that you think you're okay, but you're not." He paused and crossed his arms, looking at me in the eye. "I hate to be the one to have to tell you this, but your career is probably over." As mentioned at the top of the video, I simply couldn't talk about every mention of Shawn Michaels and the Clique because I'd be here all day. So I've took some other little bits out of the book to round off the video. If you're anything like me, you've already heard enough about Montreal 10 or 15 years ago. So let's look at some other quotes from the book. Davey and I worked tags all over Germany and the UK with Owen and Jim during a European tour in 1994. The thing I remember most about that tour was Shawn, Razor and Nash talking to me in Hamburg about the idea of forming a clique of top guys who strictly took care of their own. This is what Buddy Rogers did in the 1950s, working only with his selected clique to get him over so they could monopolise the cash flow. These boys wanted me to be their leader, to voice concerns pertaining to the group as a whole. And I'm just going to jump in here again to say that both Kevin Nash and Sean Waltman publicly denied this on Twitter. Even when reading Bret's book all those years ago, I found this to be a bit far-fetched, but I also remember Bret saying this again during an Inside the Rope show I attended a few years back. So it's not just a one-off thing he mentioned in the book by accident. Whatever the case, it was totally denied by Nash and Waltman. Even though they were my friends, I couldn't see it, and with the exception of Nash, their degree of pill popping was something I didn't want to be around. I told them, ultimately, everybody has to work their way to the top all by themselves. If someone can outperform me every night in every part of the world, then go ahead, step up and do it. One big difference between me and Shawn, which would cost him, was that I appreciated my undercard. I always took the time to shake the hands of even the lowest jobber. A relatively small babyface always needs the heels to make him, but Shawn treated a lot of the wrestlers like they weren't good enough to work with him. The clique had managed to alienate themselves from nearly everyone, even the ring crew. Ron Harris didn't take kindly to Shawn's remarks about his match. He grabbed a terrified Shawn by the neck in the shower at Madison Square Garden and told him if he wise-assed him again, he'd shove his head up his ass. The Road Warriors and Miss Elizabeth had shown up in WCW, and word was that Diesel and Razor were considering jumping too. This was a shock to everybody, especially Shawn, who looked anxious at the thought of being left behind. Despite the overall tension between the boys and the clique, Shawn and I had never let on to each other that there were any problems between us. He told me that he hoped Diesel and Razor would stay because after he became champion at WrestleMania 12, he figured on working with them. I suggested he had fresh guys to work with, such as Vader and Austin. He nervously chewed on his nail, spit out a piece and shook his head. I think I'd rather work with Hunter and do another little program with the kid. I had spoken up for Owen, Jim and Davey over the years, but I never pushed them to the exclusion of everybody else, as Shawn fully intended to do with his clique. I realised then that the Heartbreak Kid didn't have the heart to be champion. You don't have to look far on the internet to find more examples of Bret burying people he used to work with, and yeah, as much as I love the Hitman, he does come across pretty bitter sometimes, and I can see why this would be a turn-off for some fans. With that in mind, I do feel that Bret's very justified in what he says, and I also applaud him for his honesty. Finding honest main eventers in a world full of carnies is so rare, especially during Bret's era. So I say appreciate Bret while he's still here and let the Hitman go off as much as he wants. He's always an entertaining interview once he gets started. Thank you very much for watching, folks, and please take care. Right, let's get it out of the way now. Hulk Hogan tells lies. You know it, I know it, Hogan knows it, it's just a well-known fact. Wood from the Hood lies more than your current girlfriend, but for some reason, digging into his lies has always been a lot of fun, like seeing how far he would spoof just to make himself look good. With this in mind, selecting quotes from 2 Hulk Hogan autobiographies is gonna inevitably provide us with some, let's call them inconsistencies when compared with, reality. But Hogan still put his name on these books and he still allowed them to get published. So I've gone through the hassle of digging out the controversial stuff from Hulk's books, and that means you never have to read them. Aren't you lucky? And also, before you Hulkamaniacs come after me like you always tend to do, he said this stuff, not me. I'm merely pointing it all out for your enjoyment. Hogan speaks about Vince in both of his books. Do keep in mind that Hollywood Hulk Hogan was published by WWE, while My Life Outside the Ring wasn't. I was gonna say the stuff in the WWE book would be more kayfabe and fictional, but let's be real here. It's Hulk Hogan, brother. His entire existence is fictional. I'm the guy who helped make Vince McMahon a billionaire, and the way he treated me during the steroid thing, I'll never forget it. When the heat came down, he was quick to distance himself from me. That was a tough pill to swallow. We had this bond, a partnership. I wasn't just another wrestler, I was the golden goose. I helped take this little wrestling territory and turn it into a global phenomenon. We bled for each other, we took chances together. But when it got hot, when the feds were coming after us, he was worried about saving his own ass. I get it from a business standpoint, but from a brotherhood standpoint, it felt like betrayal. He went on TV and said things that made me look like I acted alone, like I'd gone rogue. The truth is, Vince knew what was going on back then, everybody did, but suddenly I was the scapegoat. That's not loyalty, that's not what I would have done to him. We had a great working relationship in the beginning. Vince would even call me at 2 in the morning to bounce ideas off me, but over time he changed. He got paranoid, he didn't trust anybody. Everything came about control with Vince. He wanted to control what you said in interviews, how you dressed in public, what you did on your off days. And if he thought you were getting too big, that you might leave or threaten his empire, he'd start burying you. Quietly at first, then all at once. It was like working with a guy who's your best friend one minute and your worst enemy the next. When I was called to testify in the steroid trial, Vince got real cold. He kept saying, "Don't worry, we've got your back," but I could tell his tone had changed. He was trying to separate himself from me, legally, publicly, and personally. I wasn't surprised. That's how Vince works. When the ship is sinking, he throws everybody else overboard. Hogan and Jesse Ventura had a strange relationship that I'd love to dig into more. Jesse saw Hogan as a Vince McMahon stooge, and Jesse also blames Hulk for the collapse of a potential wrestler union during the 80s, something that could have changed the business forever. When I agreed to come to WCW, one of their announcers was my old pal Jesse the Body Ventura, and he wasn't exactly laying out the red carpet for me. I watched him talk about me on television, and he was saying Hulk Hogan makes nothing but cheap, low-budget movies, not like Predator, the major motion picture I made with Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was knocking the hell out of me. So I called Eric Bischoff and I said, "Listen brother, I'm not interested in coming over if you're going to stick a knife in my back before I get there." From that point on, it was a downhill slide for Jesse. Eventually, he got himself fired. I had nothing to do with that, but he blamed me for it. In the AWA, he was always nice to me, at least to my face, but Jim Brunzell and Greg Gagne always told me how jealous Jesse was of me, and that he would talk trash about me as soon as my back was turned. I didn't believe it. Then, Jesse got on a radio show in Minneapolis, and all he did, week after week, was talk Hulk Hogan down. I used to get calls from people in Minnesota telling me how much Jesse hated me. I see now that Greg Gagne and Jim Brunzell were right. I believe that Jesse's a bitter guy, and I feel he's always been jealous of me and hated me. Of course, I've always done better at everything than Jesse, but the reason that happened is he made it that way. He would always knock himself out of the box before we had a chance to compete with each other. Hogan and brother Brudai, for the longest time, were very close. There was once a time where you'd see Ed Leslie right beside Hogan no matter what the Hulkster was involved in, including TV shows and movies. In later years though, their relationship went downhill, the end of the biggest bromance in pro wrestling history. Brutus and I got real serious about two things, working that club and working out in that gym. The help I needed came in two forms, needles and pills. Brutus and I were sold right then and there, and when we got into it heavy. We found pretty quickly that it was all about finding the right cocktail that worked for you. I took pills every day and shot up about every third day. The results were incredible, so I just kept going. Brutus was like a little brother to me. I looked out for him, got him booked, took him on the road, but he started thinking he was a star on my level. We were tight, real tight, but the ego got in the way. I remember him telling people that I owed him everything, that if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be where I am. Come on, brother, give me a break. I love Brutus, but he lost the plot somewhere down the road, and when the money wasn't coming in anymore, he started blaming me. I said, "Look man, I helped you when no one else would. You were drowning and I threw you a lifeline, and now you're stabbing me in the back?" It broke my heart, still does, because I thought we were family. Okay, I had to include this because Bret talked extensively about Hogan while recalling the whole WrestleMania 9 fiasco in Bret's book. Here's what Hogan had to say about that infamous day in Las Vegas. "When I got to the building, I told Vince, look man, we both know I'm done here. The moment has passed. The love affair is over. But I've got an idea that will allow me to pass the torch." "And what's that?" Vince said. After my tag match is over, when Bret Hart gets beat by Yokozuna, how about I come out to protest the way Bret lost? Yokozuna's manager, Mr. Fuji, can challenge me to get in the ring against Yokozuna, and boom, I can beat Yokozuna to win the title. Then, I go to the next pay-per-view and drop the belt right back to Yokozuna, and I'm out of here. That was the deal. Vince agreed to it, and I thought, boy, I just stole me a couple more big paydays. And I didn't mind doing a job for Yokozuna because I love the guy to death. But before we got to King of the Ring a month later, Bret Hart got in my face and said, "You son of a bitch, Vince McMahon told me you won't drop the belt to me." I said, "Brother, I'm dropping the belt to Yokozuna, that's the deal I made." And Bret said, "That's not what Vince told me. He said you wouldn't drop the belt to me because I'm not in your league and I couldn't lace your boots up." I said, "Well, how about you and me get in a room with Vince right now?" Finally, the three of us, Vince, Bret and myself, wound up in a room together. Bret said to Vince, "Didn't you tell me that Hulk Hogan wouldn't drop the belt to me?" And Vince said, "Bret, that's what you just thought you heard." I had a feeling that Vince wasn't gonna straight up with Bret, and I think Bret felt the same way. But Vince was the boss, so there was nothing Bret could do about it except fume a little. At various times, Bret and I didn't get along. Owen Hart would say, "Terry, I think my brother's overreacting. I'm on your side." Back then, I said, "We'll keep that between us. I don't want to be the one to drive a wedge between two brothers." But when Bret was having his pissing fits, Owen thought it was ridiculous. Yeah, don't believe you, mate. If this is true, it was probably Owen stirring the pot for his own amusement, but I still don't believe it. After I left Vince McMahon and joined WCW, Owen was playing a superhero character named the Blue Blazer. He was training, saying his prayers and drinking his milk, so I wonder who that was supposed to be making fun of. Meanwhile, his brother Bret was trashing me in the Calgary papers. Ever since 1993, he had been calling me a lowlife because of the misunderstanding about who I was going to drop the belt to when I made my exit. When both of us wound up in WCW, Bret came up to me and said he had overreacted and he was wrong, and I accepted his apology. We became friends after that, and when Bill Goldberg seriously injured him by accidentally kicking him in the head, the only guy Bret would wrestle would be me, because he knew I would be careful not to hurt him. This is utter bollocks. I know I shouldn't need to point this out, but just look up the match records. Hogan did not wrestle Bret after the Goldberg injury. I didn't want this to turn into another Hogan's a Liar video, but it's like Hogan doesn't give us any choice. The Great Oversell of 2005. Hogan pretty much explains what happened when he met HBK in the ring at SummerSlam that year, and I'd hazard a guess by saying his recollection of what transpired before the bout is probably a load of nonsense, but anyway, Hogan said, "When I agreed to wrestle Shawn Michaels, I thought we were going to have a fun, respectful match, but from the start there was a weird vibe between us. I'd always gotten along with Shawn, but something had changed. I think maybe he felt that I was stepping on his turf, or maybe he wanted to prove something. We were supposed to have this straight up babyface versus babyface match, two legends, one ring, but right away he started politicking. He wanted to call the shots, he wanted to control the match, control the finish, control the build up. I said, "Brother, I thought this was supposed to be a respect thing." He wanted to do a whole storyline where he exposes Hulk Hogan as a fraud. He pitched this whole thing where he brings out people from my past, where he says Hulk Hogan's a liar, Hulk Hogan's not who he says he is. I told him, "Shawn, that's not going to work, brother, the fans aren't going to buy it," but he wouldn't let it go. Vince finally had to step in and tell him, "We're not burying Hulk Hogan on national television." Even then, he tried to sabotage the whole program. I heard he went into Vince's office and said, "Why are we bringing this old man back? Why don't we just let me go over clean?" That's the kind of guy Shawn was back then, always looking out for himself, never the bigger picture. It's fucking rich, isn't it? It got to the point where he was saying, "Well, if you're going to win, I'm going to make you look bad." And that's exactly what he did. Go back and watch the match, you'll see Shawn overselling every move like a cartoon character. I hit him with a big boot and he flew halfway across the ring. I gave him a leg drop and he popped up like he had just been shot out of a cannon. It was his way of mocking me, of trying to make me look like a joke in front of the fans. After the match, he came up to me and said, "Hey, it's just business." And I said, "Business? That wasn't business, that was you being a bitch." I've wrestled a lot of guys in my time, but that was one of the most unprofessional things I've ever been part of. He can say what he wants about passing the torch or whatever, but that night it was all about Shawn trying to get himself over at my expense. No matter how hard Shawn tried to tear me down, he couldn't touch what I built. Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage. They seemed like a pair of good brothers on screen, but their relationship was often turbulent. It got so bad that Match was legit dropping diss tracks on Hulk Hogan, and when you start dropping diss tracks, you know things have gotten a bit out of hand. Randy was a night person. If someone told him his hair should be longer or maybe he shouldn't drop an elbow before he covered a guy, he would pace the floor all night long. Hell, sometimes he would stay up pacing, worrying about what colour shoelaces to put in his boots. He would drive his wife crazy because he'd never lie down, he'd never go to sleep, he was just weird that way. Randy and I used to be close, but then things changed. He started believing the paranoia, believing his own bullshit. He'd call me at all hours of the night screaming at me about Elizabeth, about how I was trying to steal her. I'm like, brother, are you out of your mind? I never looked at Elizabeth that way, never crossed that line. But Randy, he had it in his head that I was the enemy, that I was a snake in the grass. One day, he just stopped speaking to me, wouldn't even look me in the eye backstage. He'd go out of his way to bury me in promos, on camera and off. It hurt, man, because Randy was one of the most talented guys I ever worked with. But he let his demons win. The jealousy, the obsession, the need to control everything, that destroyed our friendship. Eazy-E made Hogan a lot of money, and on screen the two terrorised WCW as part of the NWO group. Still, Hogan had a few negative things to say about Bischoff in both of his books. Eric was my boy, he still is in some ways, but he didn't always back me the way I thought he would. When the politics started getting ugly in WCW and guys like Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were trying to call shots, Eric would waver. He wanted to be liked by everybody, he wanted to be one of the boys, but at some point, you gotta lead. I remember one booking meeting where I flat out said, "This isn't working, you're letting these guys run the asylum," and Eric just sat there, didn't say a damn word. Later, he told me, "Hulk, you're right, but I don't want to lose the locker room." That's not leadership, that's fear, and in the end, it cost WCW everything. Eric Bischoff was a good guy, but he was in way over his head. He had ideas, but once Nash and Hall got in his ear, it was all downhill. He lost control of WCW. I'd call him up and say, "Brother, you've got to put your foot down," and he'd say, "I hear you," but then nothing would change. At one point, he told me, "I'm sitting here with 6 of my best friends, trying to figure out how to get the nose back up on this thing." I said, "You mean you're drinking a 6-pack by yourself and you don't know what the hell to do?" That's what it came to, 6 packs and desperation. Look, I love the NWO, but I'll be honest, Nash and Hall made it hard. When we started, it was magic, electricity, but once they got a little stroke backstage, they started playing games, sandbagging matches, holding up creative. I remember Scott showing up drunk before a match and I had to carry the whole thing. He didn't even know where he was. And Kevin, he'd politic like a champ, whispering in Bischoff's ear, trying to rewrite finishes. I'm not saying I was perfect, but at least I showed up to work. Those guys got lazy real quick. They were more interested in cashing the check than building something long term. After a while, we split the NWO brand into 2 groups. There was the original black and white NWO and there was the red and black Wolfpack. And we brought in Sting and Macho Man Randy Savage and Lex Luger, even though none of these guys had a clue what NWO Cool was all about. Jesus. Then we split the brand again. Slowly but surely, we watered the whole concept down. Those of you who watch Reliving the War will find all this stuff a lot easier to digest. I just finished the whole New Blood arc for the series, so let's hear what Hogan had to say about this rough time in WCW. One thing I didn't know about Vince Russo was that he was on a mission to get rid of me. Even before he met me, he walked into a creative meeting and said he wanted to get rid of Hulk Hogan. So I never had a chance with this guy. He said I was too old to wrestle anymore, I couldn't draw money. So over the next 2 years, Russo made my life miserable. He hung me out to dry every chance he got. Little by little, Russo and WCW just ran the product into the ground and out of existence. And for me personally, those 2 years when he was in charge were hell. The only thing this guy was clear about was that he wanted me out of it. One of his big ideas was something called the Millionaires Club. He took all the WCW wrestlers who were over 40 or who had made it in the business and stuck them in the Millionaires Club. Then he took all the young guys who hadn't established themselves yet and called them the New Blood. It was Vince Russo's way of trying to say we were rich, pompous prima donnas whose best days were behind us. But when he would have one of the young guys in the New Blood beat a guy in the Millionaires Club, the idea would backfire on him and the fans would boo the young guy. Russo said he couldn't understand why, but we knew. The fans loved the guys they knew. One time Russo told me he was trying to make a name for Billy Kidman, one of the newer guys in WCW, and he wanted to get me involved. I said, sure brother, I'll do whatever you want. So Russo had me lose to Kidman, who weighed about 180 pounds, 2 or 3 weeks in a row. Finally, I got lucky at a pay-per-view and beat this kid. It made me look ridiculous, but I went along with it. At the end of that, Billy Kidman was supposed to get this big push, but a week later, Russo had him in a Viagra on a pole match, where the loser had to take a whole bottle of Viagra, and Kidman lost. Then they took him off TV. So why did they sacrifice Hulk Hogan and let Billy Kidman beat him 3-4 weeks in a row if they weren't going to make Billy Kidman a star? It didn't make any sense to me. The more I saw Russo, the more I realised he was a guy I totally disagreed with, but he was accomplishing one thing. He was doing what he said he would do, slowly but surely driving me out of the wrestling business. I'll never forget when Russo had me lie down in the middle of the ring at Halloween Havoc 99 without wrestling even for a second, and let Sting put his foot on me to win the match. Russo said he had some great plan, he was going to bring me back in 2 or 3 weeks. He never did. And when the ratings fell, it was Bischoff who called me back, not Russo. Russo basically used me as a whipping boy. I felt like I was losing more matches than ever. It got to the point where the people went, Hogan might be old, but that guy can't beat him. It got crazy. Little by little, Russo and WCW just ran the product into the ground and out of existence. And for me personally, those 2 years when he was in charge were hell. The only thing this guy was clear about in the wrestling business was that he wanted me out of it. I didn't think Hulk had any issues with Billy Boy, but turns out he wasn't a fan of Goldberg refusing to do jobs. Pot, meat, kettle. I was scheduled to wrestle him in a dark match, a match that would be seen by the people in the arena but not on TV. I told Eric Bischoff to switch gears, televise the match and let Bill Goldberg win. I said nothing would have more impact now than Goldberg beating Hogan for the belt. He seems to be a great guy, why don't you give him a chance? Eric Bischoff made a call and it was all arranged. The match went off and Goldberg beat me. Good sport that I was, I put the belt on him myself. Fuck me. People in the state of Georgia were happy that I got my ass beat by their homeboy. Unfortunately, nobody else in America seemed to feel that way. The numbers didn't change. The only thing that was different was that Bill Goldberg had the belt, and that turned out to be another type of problem. All of a sudden, he became this monster who didn't ever want to lose a match. He just stopped like a mule in midstream and said, I'm not losing. You have to be flexible in the wrestling business. You have to be able to go in different directions. When a guy's one-dimensional, you can't do anything with him. You can't write storylines and create emotion when somebody refuses to do business. So working with Bill Goldberg became a nightmare. Again, this is all very, very rich coming from Hulk Hogan. Ultimate Warrior was the most chiseled bodybuilder to come into the wrestling business. Also, he had an interesting mystique about him. He talked about the mighty warriors in heaven and stuff like that. He had a pretty good rap. But when he got into the ring, after he ran in and shook the ropes and stuff, he had no game. He had no wrestling psychology, and that's what it's all about, creating emotion. Great guy, nice guy, but really just a flash in the pan. Vince McMahon wanted Ultimate Warrior to beat me for the belt. I didn't agree with him. I didn't think the guy could carry the load. Then again, maybe I didn't give Vince a choice in the matter. At the end of the night, the referee was supposed to get the belt from the timekeeper and give it to Ultimate Warrior, but this was my chance to steal back everything that he had gotten from me. So I zipped over to the timekeeper and ripped the belt out of his hand. Then I walked up on the ring apron with the belt, looked up to God, shook my head, yes, walked into the ring and handed Ultimate Warrior the belt. As I left the arena, 68,000 people in the Sky Dome watched me go. Ultimate Warrior held the belt over his head in victory, and no one cared. It turned out I was right about Ultimate Warrior. He couldn't carry the load as heavyweight champion, not the way Hulk Hogan had. Vince's attempt to move in a different direction hadn't been the success he hoped it would be. Eventually, he decided he would have Ultimate Warrior drop the belt to Sergeant Slaughter. Thank you for watching, brother, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Hogan's books are so hard to read because his reputation of being a serial liar means you're second guessing everything he says. Some of the stuff you don't need to second guess, you just know it's factually incorrect. And so when Hogan talks about his personal life in his second book and stuff he'd only know about, you naturally assume he's embellishing the truth or making himself out to be the good guy. Typical case of the boy who cried wolf. Anyway, again, thank you so much for watching, folks, and please take care. Roddy Piper's book, In the Pit with Piper, is very eye-opening, and seeing as you guys are still enjoying these kind of videos, I thought I'd share some interesting quotes from this book. To be honest, this one's quite disjointed, and Piper, quite commonly, would jump from one subject to another only to go back to his original talking point, so it's not as straightforward as other wrestler autobiographies, though it still is interesting. I also noticed he blends kayfabe and reality a few times, which can make things a bit frustrating, but when Piper does talk about reality, it can be quite hard-hitting. Do keep in mind that this book was published in 2002, and Roddy would have another run with the WWE after the book was released, though at the time of writing, Piper was seemingly done with the WWE. Quotes in this video have been amalgamated slightly to make it a bit easier to digest in video form, though everything is word for word. Vince McMahon's a big focal point of the book, and I didn't want to spend too much time on McMahon, seeing as there's other more interesting stuff in my opinion. But here's a brief insight into Piper's thoughts on Vince. The reason McMahon called me Hot Rod was that it's a name I made up before I came to the WWF, and he trademarked it, hoping to capitalize on it one day. He kept calling me Hot Rod instead of Roddy Piper because he owned that name, and it was also part of the brainwashing that he used on all his wrestlers to try and show he was in control. To him, he owned Hot Rod. He may very well have owned the name, but he sure as hell didn't own me. I wasn't intimidated by him or his tactics. Normally, when we were in an arena, the billboard outside showcased the talent that was going to wrestle that night, such as Roddy Piper versus Hulk Hogan, and that would be what attracted the people. But McMahon slowly changed the billing on the marquee to highlight the WWF instead of putting our names there. While our names were still drawing to record crowds, McMahon was trying to make it look like it was the WWF name and not the wrestlers that was bringing in the fans. Eventually, of course, the WWF name had all the power, and with the wrestlers losing top billing, McMahon could now pay them much less. It was now the WWF coming into town as opposed to whatever the main event was. But let's get something clear, folks. McMahon did not make the WWF. The wrestlers did. Piper credits Alfred Hayes as a man who helped him out and taught him many things about pro wrestling and the lifestyle he was getting himself into. However, Hayes also played a pretty brutal rib on Piper that affected Roddy on a seemingly deep level. I'm standing in the dressing room in Kansas City and Bob Geigel, a great amateur and professional wrestler and promoter, calls me over. "Hey kid, I want to talk to you." I was very interested to hear what he had to say about wrestling. I was always looking to get advice from guys who'd been around for a while and were top-notch wrestlers. I was so engrossed in what Mr. Geigel was saying that I tuned out everyone and everything around me. I was so distracted by Geigel that I was leaning against the bench with my hand behind me and somebody put something in it without me realising it. Finally, Mr. Geigel finishes talking and I notice that something's in my hand, so I squeeze it a few times and turn around to see it's Lord Alfred Hayes' donkey-sized penis. My mentors were now rolling on the floor laughing at me as this whole thing had been a setup. Me, I felt humiliated, hurt, embarrassed and angered all at once. You've got to understand, I'd been living on the streets for 2 years. When you're on the street, you're constantly fighting. I thought I was away from all that. I thought I was in a room with a bunch of men I could trust, but now I didn't know what to think. And I couldn't do anything because there was nobody in this group who I could beat up, so what the hell was I gonna do? I got to the point where I wouldn't shower in the same room as them anymore. I would go to the arena, change into my kilt in the car, then wait outside until it was my turn to go on. Then, after I finished, I would go back outside the arena to wait for my ride. If we didn't hit a gym along our bookings route where I could shower, I would stay dirty. Piper's dislike of Mr. T is well documented, and I could fill up this whole video runtime with Mr. T quotes from Piper. I've condensed things down here to give you a general idea of why these two didn't see eye to eye. Vince held a press conference at the Rockefeller Center a few weeks prior to WrestleMania. I noticed there was a sign on the table that said Roddy Piper, and before I could slide into my chair without disrupting what was going on, Mr. T stands up and flexes his biceps towards me and says in his usual tone, "I pity you, fool." The A-Team star also had one of those metal bars with a spring in it that he was bending in his gloved hands. And while he was standing there flexing his muscles, I walked over to him and coolly squeezed his head and said, "Gee, it feels pretty soft to me." Then, for good measure, I gave his mohawk a little rub. Well, did this ever get T and me started off on the wrong foot? I didn't know you weren't supposed to touch Mr. T, let alone feel his head. This really pissed him off, but to be honest, I really didn't care. This was my element, my place of work. He was just along for the ride. Mr. T took an instant dislike to me, and I could sense that there was now a problem arising between the two of us before the match that was about to take place. The matter got worse when Vince and his boys wanted me to take a dive in the main event. And I'm just going to cut in here. I'm sure everyone knows this, but when Piper says take a dive, he means do the job. And I'm only mentioning this because he says dive quite a few times here. But Vince and his boys wanted me to take a dive in the main event, causing my partner and me to lose to Mr. T and Hogan. For a second time in a few months, I had to refuse to lose, especially to a foreigner who they were bringing into our wrestling culture. The reason I flat out refused was strictly business. If I took a dive here to this clown, where would I go the next time they brought an outsider into our world? If it had been one of our guys, I would have taken the fall, but my thinking was, if you take an outsider who's just going to do a wrestling event then leave, why give him the fall and let him go back to his industry laughing at me behind my back and portraying everything in our world as a joke? In my eyes, it was wrong according to the code of ethics I had been taught. Well, I guess my unhappiness about this got out in the locker room, and McMahon went to Orndorff, and Paul told him the same thing, a blunt no. So now we've got a big time match here, and nobody's willing to take the dive against the intruder. In a last ditch effort to get me to change my mind, Vince asked to talk to me, but I stood my ground and told him that it was wrong, and that I wouldn't do it. I knew my value in the sport, and I also knew what the wrestling code of ethics was, and I wasn't going to let McMahon or anybody else make a fool of me or our profession. Right before WrestleMania, Mr. T and I were in this warehouse with Vince McMahon, and the bookers were trying to teach Mr. T basics like how to lock up. This made my animosity meter go a few notches higher. I was already hot over Vince asking me to lose to this guy. Now I see that Mr. T didn't know the first thing about wrestling. This really insulted me. Before the match, he started breathing into this oxygen mask. I now thought there was something physically wrong with the guy and that we were going to have to go on without him. But little did I know that he was doing this to get ready for the match. This was part of his training. What a loser. Just to continue on from the Mr. T quotes, here's what Piper had to say about Hulk Hogan in the success of WrestleMania 1. No one's denying that Hulk Hogan played a major role in catapulting wrestling to the height of its popularity in the 80s, but people fail to realise that although Hulkamania was running wild at the time, he was usually running from Rowdy Roddy Piper. Little did everyone know that Hogan was popping vitamins like M&Ms in order to try and keep up with me on the mat. Vince Sr. and Jr. never expected Roddy Piper to be able to rival their new chosen son. I mean, out of the 25 top dogs, I was the smallest. I didn't have any angles, I didn't have the office behind me. All I had was what my forefathers taught me and what I'd learned from my wars in the ring. But that was enough to get me over. When all was said and done, who really drew WrestleMania 1? It's no secret that they pushed Hogan and gave him most of the credit, as evidenced by the post-game parties thrown for him, but I truly believe I played a significant role in the success of that event. I put my life and ass on the line and was willing to die in the ring if that's what it took to make Mania a success. And what did I get when it was all over? Nothing. No limo, no party, no thank you. I was left to fend for myself while Hogan and his crew were off drinking and munching on McMahon's tab. After all, if you look into all the effort and hype that went into WrestleMania, who was the one who was stirring all the interest? It wasn't Hogan, it was me. I'd been hyping the event for weeks on Piper's Pit, which was the most watched part of a wrestling show, not Hogan's matches. The segment allowed us to promo the event every time we wrestled the card, and it also broadened our demographics by twofold at the time, allowing us to reach way more people than even Vince imagined. Even though these people were rooting against me, they either bought a ticket or were tuning in to see what was going to happen to me. Let the truth be known, people didn't watch WrestleMania to see Hulk Hogan win. They watched hoping Roddy Piper would get his ass beat. Not only did Piper talk about the infamous squeegee incident involving Sid, but he also gives good insight into the manner in which Vince McMahon introduced Sid to the WWF roster. One day I came into an arena at about 1 PM for a television shoot. I passed by the blackboard that had the matches chalked on them. Chalk is easily erased if a wrestler's dropped. I saw Vince McMahon Jr. beaming, standing next to his newest wonder of the world prodigy, the 6'7", 300-pound chisel mass of Sid Vicious. They were both greeting people who passed by. Let me try to help you understand what was going on here. The promoter's motive and manipulation was to make all of the other wrestlers remember that everyone is replaceable and that there is always someone ready to take their job. He was also reinforcing the possibility that a few more shots of testosterone may be in order for them to keep their jobs. Lastly, and unbeknownst to Sid, Vince was turning the boys against the newcomer, ensuring that he would become Vince's ally and confidant. This particular case, however, was one in which the simple manipulation 101 tactic came back to bite Vince in the ass. Sid had been told prior to being put in the display window that he was the chosen one, that he would be the next world champion. He had been flown first class around the country and driven around in style in stretch limousines, unlike the other 98% of the wrestlers. So 2 days later, Sid, having now graduated from manipulation 101 and believing every word he had been told, went back to Atlanta to prepare for his move to the Big Apple. Let me remind you that Sid had been hanging out with the WCW wrestlers and that Atlanta was the WCW's backyard. When he arrived in Atlanta, he went to a local bar. He started drinking and bragging about his new position in the WWF. By this time, there wasn't a wrestler anywhere who hadn't heard about Vince naming Sid his golden child and giving him the royal treatment. One of the greatest weapons in a promoter's arsenal is jealousy, and thanks to Sid, it was working like a charm. Sid, a wonderful guy who just happened to get caught in the web of manipulation at the same time, certainly didn't help the situation with his newfound arrogance. As Sid's alcohol level rose, so did his level of bragging, and unfortunately for him, so did the blood pressure of every wrestler in the bar. Eventually, some of the WCW wrestlers had heard all they could take. They literally threw Sid out of the bar. Peace and whiskey tranquility filled the room and nobody gave the incident a second thought. He was just another asshole passing through. Suddenly, the Vicious came out of Sid and the bar entrance was filled with his mammoth presence. He began ranting the best 30-second promo of his life, where's a camera when you need it, holding a weapon in his hand. He was screaming, "Come on, all you f***s, I'll take you all on." He waved the object around the room. It was supposed to even the odds against the 12 WCW wrestlers present. His curious eyes tried to focus upon the weapon he was waving around. People began screaming, "He's got a pipe. No, he's got a bat. Shit, he went and got a crowbar out of his car." Then, a soft, squeaky voice broke through the mayhem. "Nah, he's got a squeegee," it said. "A what?" Michael Graham, all 5 feet 6 inches and 185 pounds of him, stood up from his table and made sure everyone understood what he was saying. "He's packing a f***ing squeegee." The pint-sized Graham, who was tough as nails, walked straight up to Sid and, staring him straight in the navel, said, "If you don't shut up and get out of here now, I'm going to shove that squeegee up your ass." The reality of the situation kicked in. Sid had to be asking himself through his alcohol-befuddled brain, "What am I doing?" And he turned and walked out the door. It was too late, however, the damage had been done. When I walked into the WWF arena the following day, the building was riddled with squeegees, complemented by a chalkboard illustration from an unknown artist, actually Bret Hart, depicting all the antics that had taken place the night before. Piper states in his book that he and Kerry Von Erich had deep conversations about life. Some of these conversations even involved ending one's own life, according to Roddy. Here though, he tells a pretty heartwarming story about Kerry before it gets a bit dark. It was midnight and we were in Miami in the Marriott Airport Hotel, as we lovingly called it. I was there with a fine man and athlete known as Kerry Von Erich. We were the best of friends. In fact, he felt comfortable enough to sit with me in a hotel room and shoot the breeze with his prosthetic off. Kerry had lost his foot in a motorcycle accident. This night, as we entered our hotel room, I put the bolt out to leave the hotel room door ajar. This was the traditional wrestler's way. We did this so when room service came, we wouldn't have to get off our lazy asses to answer the door. We did our wrestler's routine by unpacking and putting our wrestling tights over the lampshades. They make quite good clothes dryers. We then sat down on our respective beds and proceeded to share a joint. Kerry had shared some very intimate stories about his brothers with me, and I shared stories about myself. This evening, however, there was happiness in the air and no mention of any negative things. As we smoked, we both got up and talked our way over to the window. One of us opened it, and to our surprise, we found out it was large enough to fit a human body through. Without breaking the stride of our giggling conversation, we both climbed through the 8th story window and onto the ledge. The two of us were as high as kites, standing with our backs to the building on a ledge that was approximately 8 inches wide. Not even the slamming of the window broke the rhythm of our bubbly conversation. We were now trapped outside. Upon realising our predicament, we giggled and I pulled another joint out of my pocket which we lit up and smoked. We were just enjoying the view. I don't know how long we were out there, but suddenly Big Boss Man and Kurt Hennig were frantically opening the window and pulling us back in, almost losing Kerry in the process. No questions were asked and the night went on. Approximately 2 months later, my friend Kerry shot himself in the heart. I know why. It was this sickness. The sickness is not something a wrestler's born with. He inherits it later in life from his forefathers who don't know the legacy they're leaving behind. But the promoters make sure it's passed on in a very cold and calculated, tried and true way. The amount of sickness in the wrestler is directly proportional to the amount of manipulation used by the promoter. In order to understand the sickness completely, you must also understand the extent of the manipulation. Piper has nothing bad to say about Jim Neidhart, but he instead tells a funny story about Jim missing some work dates and the excuse he made up when confronted. The best job-saving excuse I ever heard came from Jim the Anvil Neidhart in the Boston Garden dressing room. The Anvil was a 5'8", 300-pound powerhouse who looked like a refugee from ZZ Top. Jim had a slight problem. He was always missing matches, so we dubbed him Missing in Action. One time, Jim had been MIA for 3 consecutive days, missing 3 wrestling matches in a row. You didn't do that if you wanted to earn a living in the ring. It was considered a mortal sin. To compound Jim's problems, it was his 2nd MIA that month. When he finally showed up for work that day in the Boston Garden, he was met by an old-timer named Chief Jay Strongbow, who'd been made a road agent by the WWF. A road agent at that time was basically a washroom monitor who had the ability to get you fired. Again, this was Jim's 2nd disappearance that month, so the scene was very serious. Jim had 3 lovely children and a wife at home, so termination was not an option for him. His explanation went something like this. Chief, it was midnight, and I was driving home from Dayton when all of a sudden I heard a bump outside my car, so I figured I must have hit something. I pulled the car over to the side of the road, and in the blackness of the night I ran back to help the poor little animal I had so irresponsibly hit. Then Jim started running in place, all 300 pounds of him acting out the scene. As he got deeper and deeper into the story, Jim repeatedly pulled on that fire engine red goatee. Chief, he said, it was a cat and I love pussies, so I bent down to help the poor little thing. But I found out it doesn't pay to be nice. That stupid little son of a bitch scratched the shit out of me. Jim, letting his true colours shine through, continued to explain that as he started driving home, he got lightheaded and dizzy and his stomach felt kinda queasy. His vision then started getting blurry, but luckily he saw a hospital sign and headed right for the emergency room. He was then in a coma for 2 straight days. With a concerned look on his face, the chief asked Jim if he was okay. Jim replied, "Chief, I'm okay. I've been cleared to wrestle." The chief breathed a sigh of relief, since substitutions are not received kindly by wrestling fans on a wrestling card, and told Jim to go get ready. The chief slowly walked away, scratching his head, utterly confused. He must have been thinking, is this guy pulling my leg or what? What the hell could you catch from a stray cat? About 10 minutes later, as Jim was heading out into the arena to wrestle, the Chief stopped and asked, "So what the f did you have again? Was it the flu?" "No," Jim said and kept walking away. "Then what was it?" the Chief asked again. And as Jim went through the curtain on his way to the ring, his voice trailed behind him, saying, "Cat scratch fever, Chief, cat scratch fever." You just can't make stuff like that up, folks. Vince Russo really did not like Roddy Piper, even though he didn't know me from Adam Bomb. I soon found out by way of his messengers that I wasn't involved in his plans for the future. One night I was in my dressing room when someone knocked on my door. Ed Ferrara, a scripter who was working with Russo, walked in carrying 3 or 4 sheets of paper. It was written dialogue of what they wanted me to say. As soon as I found out what the papers were for, I politely told Ferrara to tell Russo to come meet me in my dressing room so we could discuss the dialogue. But what was unusual here was that this snot-nosed know-nothing had taken over as the creative force behind WCW, and he didn't even come in to see me and introduce himself. Well, he again sent his second-in-command in with these papers telling me what to do. Knowing that Russo wasn't going to show his chicken shit ass, I took a look at the script and it had profanity all through it, and I knew exactly what was going on. When Ed Ferrara came back in the third time, I asked him to sit down. I told him that I never used profanity in my interviews, ever, and that through my entire career I never followed a script. Ferrara said that he understood that, but he and Russo wanted to take the WCW in a new direction and that from now on everything was going to be scripted. I said okay, I would tell them what I was going to say. I then proceeded to ask him if he and Russo had pretty thick skin. He answered me yes and then asked why I wanted to know this. I told him that I was going to do an interview that night about them and I didn't want to hurt their feelings. He then answered me with all the arrogance he could muster. "Thick-skinned? They've called Vince Russo and me everything you can think of. We're rhino high tough and can resist anything thrown at us." I told him I was aware that he and Russo had been working hard and writing in New York for the last 2 years, making a name for themselves. He told me yeah, that was correct. I then said, "Oh, then you must be the 2 motherfuckers who were responsible for writing the script that led to the tragic death of my cousin Owen Hart." I'm telling you folks, a bead of sweat shot out of the right side of his temple. I kid you not, I have never seen this before. He turned many colours and didn't know what to say. He immediately bolted from my dressing room, and less than 3 minutes later, he came back with Bill Bush, who was the WCW president at the time, and Vince Russo, and they were at my door trying to talk me out of repeating what I'd said to Ferrara on television. So I guess Vince Russo did want to come and see me after all. Vince Russo tried to use his best cleverness to water down my interview. I already knew that I wasn't going to mention Owen Hart. He had just passed away and I have too much respect for his family to use such a thing as a piece of business. But Russo and company didn't know this, of course. I just needed to let them know that they were playing with the big boys now. Finally, I said, "I'll tell you what, I don't need to mention Hart. I'll just incorporate your points into the interview." I believe I succeeded in getting my point across to these know-nothings. Loads of wrestling books make you second guess if the superstar in question has actually written the words or at least spoken into a dictaphone to have his words transcribed. That is not the case with Piper's book. The way it's written, the verbiage he uses, and the kind of scatterbrained way in which the book's been written does make you realise that yeah, this all came from Piper. So for that reason alone, it is worth picking up. There's loads more stories in the book, with some being pretty bleak, especially when Piper talks about his youth. So pick it up if you're interested in learning more. As a quick heads up, it isn't going as cheap as other wrestling books, but it's worth picking up if you're at all interested in Piper's career. Thanks for watching folks, and please take care. So, I had to read Vince Russo's 2 books, Forgiven and Ring Opera, and I'm going to be honest, I had a great time getting into the mind of one of pro wrestling's most controversial figures. Whereas other wrestling books can be a bit vanilla and quite by the numbers, Russo's books can sometimes read like his old WWF magazine articles, so his writings aren't typical by any means, and Vince expects his readers to be generally up to speed with what's been going on in the pro wrestling world. Loads of the stories he tells have been debated over the years. Some say his books have a lot of old rubbish included, such as Russo saying the Montreal incident was all his idea. But I enjoyed Vince's books because even if he is perceived as wrong, he's dead set on his philosophies, his thoughts on the business, and the things he truly believes in. You don't have to be a fan of the guy's work to appreciate his unrelenting convictions, whether right or wrong. I picked out some quotes that I felt you guys would enjoy. I'm unable to pick out every single controversial quote or quip because there's just so many of them, but these are the ones I thought my viewers would get the most out of. You may have heard some of these stories before, but they're definitely worth revisiting. So let's start with Russo's best friend in the entire world, Mr. James E. Cornette. I'll also let you know what book each quote's from if you want to read more. I wasn't just working with Vince McMahon, I was working with Vince McMahon and James E. Cornette. Man, this was a mistake. You see, at the time, Jim Cornette and I went together like Ludacris and NASCAR. I wanted attitude, he wanted Bullet Bob Armstrong. To give you an example of Cornette's mindset, he actually used to travel around with a gun under the driver's seat of his car in case he was attacked by fans, because he was a heel. We're talking 1997 here, folks, not 1977. Personally, I had nothing against Jim. I just felt his way of thinking in 1997 was wrong. In my opinion, you can't book now like you did 20 years ago because the fans are smart. They know it's a work. Today's fans react to the product in a negative way if they feel their intelligence is being insulted. Old school bookings based on one simple axiom: the fans are stupid and they'll eat whatever you serve them because they don't know enough to question why you're booking what you're booking. In their minds, no one's booking anything. It's all happening for real. Even though we were driving McMahon nuts, I stuck to my guns because I knew I was right. As a company, I knew where we had to go. My advantage actually came from studying my son Will, who was about 11. I used to make a point of seeing what was hip to him. What was he watching? What was he listening to? Yeah, he was a bit younger than our demographic, but he was the next generation. He was the future. Cornette, Vince, Pritchard, Ross, none of them had that advantage. After a few weeks, I could see Vince was coming around more and more to my way of thinking, and then Cornette came up with the angle that would forever seal his fate on the booking committee. Jim's idea was to have Cactus Jack, aka Mick Foley, wheel a huge box down the ringside. Week after week we would see this box until Terry Funk emerged. When asked why, Jim answered, "Anybody who comes out of a box is instantly over." To this day, that's the greatest line I've ever heard. I've even considered using it for the title of this book. I thought Vince was gonna die when he heard it. To appease Jim, Vince came up with the character of Chainsaw Charlie, who would chainsaw his way out of the box immediately upon his arrival in the WWF. Man, it just wasn't gonna work. Cornette and Russo, all that arguing. All we were doing was wasting Vince's time and the company's money. I had a meeting with Vince and told him exactly that. I said one of us had to go, and if it was me, I totally understood. The next week, Cornette was off the booking committee. Rock bottom. When you hit it, you know it. There's no place else to sink. When the creative team wrote in Fake Razor and Fake Diesel, the former WWF characters of Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, who we'd lost to WCW, that was it for me. Embarrassed isn't the word. I had moved on to ashamed. What really boggled my mind was the fact that Vince himself was going along with it. At the time, I felt it was a total disgrace. How Vince could ever have thought that this was going to work was way beyond my comprehension. It's kind of like the Mets deciding to trade Mike Piazza, replacing him with me, and then trying to pass me off as Mike Piazza. It was inexcusable. At times I thought Vince had lost his mind. He was nearing desperation, if not already beyond it. I was told at the time that the WWF was tightroping that thin monetary line between black and red. Many inside Titan Tower suspected that Vince was in financial trouble, even though that was kept hush-hush. Me, I'd given up. The product was unwatchable. I had to laugh when the Fake Diesel and Fake Razor angle became such a disgrace that, in the storyline itself, they wound up putting the heat on good old JR. The Yoki was bringing these guys into the Federation to get back at Vince McMahon for firing him a couple of years earlier. The good thing, at least writers were starting to use some reality in their storylines. The bad thing was they couldn't figure out the best way to execute it. It was pathetic. I'd seen better Corey Feldman movies. It was getting to the point I didn't want to be associated with the company. It was only a matter of time before I opened the doors and invited Glenn into the creative meetings at WCW. If not for anything else, I was always highly entertained. Glenn was harmless and we all knew that and loved him for it. He made the creative meetings enjoyable, a word that isn't often used in the wrestling business. Glenn always had a way of reminding us that this was supposed to be fun, not the living hell that it had turned into for most of us. I think for as long as I live, I will never forget one of Glenn's favourite pitches. I remember one day walking into the creative meeting a few minutes early and seeing Glenn writing feverishly on the boardroom whiteboard. The diagram he was scribbling seemed somewhat involved and intriguing, but I had no idea what it was. I had to interrupt the genius at work and ask, "Glenn, what's this?" Without missing a beat, he turned around and said, "This is the angle that's going to change the face of the wrestling business forever." It's hard to describe his childlike excitement. It's the Martian invasion angle. There's a takeover in WCW by a hostile heel group. Keep in mind that Glenn's using his self-drawn diagrams to help bring light to his vision. And in time, it's revealed that they're Martians and their leader is Lance Storm. But wait, there's a twist. Just when it looks like the Martians are going to be in total control of WCW, we pan over to the announce desk and zoom in on Mike Tenay. Appearing in an almost hypnotic state, Mike slowly rises from his chair. Then the unthinkable happens. Antennas sprout from Mike's head and we find out that he, not Lance, was the mastermind behind the takeover all along. What do you think? The truth? I thought it was genius. You see, unlike wrestlers who claim to be writers but are actually bookers, Glenn resides outside the box. There is no black, no white, no baby faces, no heels. Is "Hey Hey We're the Monkeys" once crowned? Only shades of grey. Everybody in the wrestling business is going to hate me for saying this because they're never going to hear the end of it. But yes, Glenn Gilberty is a creative genius. A few years ago, when I almost went back to the WWE, I told Vince about Glenn and proposed to him that once I came back, I wanted Disco to be part of the creative team. Vince had no problem with this, since I had never steered him wrong before when it came to someone else's talents. I went back a few weeks later to further talk things out. Prior to wrapping up our covert meeting, I asked Vince when I could tell Glenn that he could start. Vince paused, and I knew there was a problem. With a look of severe seriousness on his face, the boss looked at me and said, I'm not too sure about your friend Glenn, Vince. I heard something about some ridiculous Martian invasion angle that he wanted to do at WCW, and I just don't know." Let me break it down for you. Somehow, someway, somebody within WCW who wanted to bury Glenn out of pure jealousy caught wind of Glenn's Martian invasion angle. That certain someone took the story to the dirt sheets who printed it, not as a goof, but as Glenn being serious. Now, on the other side at the WWE, someone close to Vince, they had to be close to Vince because Vince would have had to tell them about hiring Disco, reads the dirt sheet. Vince never reads the sheets himself. In an effort to discredit Glenn, obviously because of their own insecurities, they tell Vince about the strange and questionable creativity of his new would-be booker. Vince in turn buys the Martian invasion angle as serious, so he now tells me he has second thoughts about Glenn. You couldn't make a story like that up. To this day, I take nothing away from Goldberg. Nothing. Sure, there are those who'll tell you that it was scripted, that he went out there and beat everybody in the world in seconds, but remember, with each and every spear, he had to make you believe it, and Goldberg did. When I joined WCW, I felt that Hulk and Flair immediately needed to be fixed. Right or wrong, that was my professional opinion. At the same time, I also felt that Bill Goldberg needed his share of some tweaking. By some means, we needed to humanise this animal. We needed the fans to see a different side of Goldberg, that he was human, flesh and bone just like everyone else. The only way that was going to be accomplished was by having him losing. In order for us to take the character to the next level, we had to see how he would deal with adversity. And I'm not talking about Goldberg losing to some slouch or being upset. My choice of the man to defeat Goldberg was Big Papa Pump Scott Steiner. Goldberg hated it from the get-go, and not only that, he resented me for even coming up with the idea. I explained to him face to face, man to man, that I thought it was the best thing for the company. Bill vehemently disagreed. When I then flat out asked him what the problem was, Goldberg looked at me and said, if this were real, Scotty would never beat me. How do you respond to that? Not only wasn't wrestling real, but I also had to question whether or not Bill could legitimately beat Steiner. The truth is, on his best day, I don't even think he would have come close. At that point, I realised I wasn't going to get anywhere with Bill. He flat out wasn't going to lose to Steiner, period. At this point, I had no choice but to go to the Yankee ball cap wearing head of TBS and TNT, Brad Siegel, for advice. During our phone conversation, Brad couldn't believe what I was telling him. He kept saying over and over again, but it's not real, it's wrestling. Finally, Brad had no choice but to fly Goldberg to his office in Atlanta with Bill's agent, so the head of TNT and TBS could tell him that he had to lose a fake wrestling match. Being at that meeting was almost surreal. The head of Turner Broadcasting was taking time out of his schedule to tell a grown man and his agent that he had to lose a scripted match. Leaving Brad's office that day, I knew that the issue wasn't over. Bill made that clear when he left the office red-faced. Unfortunately, I, and I alone, was going to have to make sure that this thing was executed the day of the pay-per-view. It was hours before the pay-per-view, and I was doing what I usually do, making sure that the talent was as prepared as they possibly could be. With my production tunnel vision in full effect, I was interrupted by head agent Johnny Ace Laurinaitis. Vince, he said, "You've got to go in there," pointing to Bill Goldberg's locker room. "It's Goldberg, he doesn't want to do the job." You know what? At this point, I wasn't scared, I wasn't intimidated, and I wasn't panicked. I was just fed up. I went into Goldberg's locker room without hesitation. I immediately saw Bill sitting in a chair backwards, staring into space and breathing heavy, real heavy. To this day, I don't think I've ever seen someone that mad. Suddenly, he started this rocking motion, coming across like a coiled cobra just moments before he was about to strike. I remember looking at him and not being scared at all. Why? Because I just couldn't believe how ridiculous this all was. We're talking about a grown man losing a fake match. At that point, I grabbed another chair that was in the room, turned it around just like Bill was, and sat face to face with this breathing, snorting, coiled dragon. I remember asking Bill what the problem was, and his answer was deafening silence. He just began to snort louder and rock faster. Where these next words came from, I have no idea. I'm not that brave or that stupid. Without hesitation, I blurted out, "You're not intimidating me, so if you're going to hit me, and let's get this thing over with." I guess it was the shock of the sentence that caught Bill off guard and almost immediately changed his demeanour. "I'm not going to hit you." And at that point, the conversation was over. I got up and left the room, and later that night, Goldberg lost to Scott Steiner. Looking back, I guess I kinda backed Bill into a corner, calling his bluff. I mean, if he wasn't going to hit me, then what was he going to do? Brad Siegel's word was final, and he knew that. In hindsight, WCW created a monster in Goldberg before I even got there. They allowed him the power to believe his own hype, to believe he was something that, in retrospect, he really wasn't. I blame the machine for this one, I truly do. Bill Goldberg has too big a heart, as I witnessed when I saw him many times around kids, to be a bad guy. Let's call a spade a spade. I never, not for one day, enjoyed working with Scott Hall. From the minute I met Scott, he was difficult to deal with. Whether he was just kidding or that was just him, it was a chore. The guy just liked to make your job harder, plain and simple. Now that's okay once in a while, but with Scott, it was all the time. The sad part about it was that when you finally got Scott to do what you wanted him to do, he was without a doubt one of the best in the business. Unfortunately, those times were rare, for me anyway. Regardless of what anybody tells you, Scott could turn it on and off. The reason I say that is because when I saw him around kids, Scott was a different person. He acted as a hero to them. I saw it in person when he took some time with my own nephew many years ago. Around a child who only knew him as a star, Scott lived up to the billing of hero, but when I worked with Hall, he chose to be difficult, primarily because he saw it as part of his gimmick. Still though, I don't know Scott well. I believe inside he has a heart of gold. Kevin Nash, he'd drive Freud nuts. The guy is one of the greatest manipulators I've ever seen, and I'm not saying that in a negative way. Kevin is street smart, probably more street smart than anyone I've ever met. He can read people and own people. Combine his mental ability and his physical presence, and Nash is an imposing force. Many people are intimidated by him. Kevin knows that, and he enjoys it. The guy is just so sharp. If I have one criticism of Kevin, it's that at times he can be moody. When he'd show up for work, I never knew which Nash I was going to be dealing with, but at the time I was probably one of the moodiest guys you'd ever meet. But I just want to say this about Kevin Nash. When he worked for WCW, he did everything I ever asked him to do, period. Yeah, many times he'd screw with you before he did it, but that's just Kevin. Shawn and I had a love-hate relationship from the beginning. My impression, he was probably a bit spoiled growing up, as many of us were. However, as an adult, if Shawn Michaels didn't get his way, he was difficult to deal with at times. And when he wasn't happy with something, he let you know. On more occasions than one, I witnessed Shawn standing up to Vince, with Vince completely backing down. Now, whether it was Vince just not wanting to deal with him, I don't know, but 9 out of 10 times Shawn got his way with the boss. I never saw anyone else confront Vince the way Shawn did, ever. One of the most difficult things I had to do during my tenure as head writer for the World Wrestling Federation was to look at Mick Foley in the eye and tell him he wasn't going to be a part of the main event at WrestleMania 15. Mick's dream was the main event at WrestleMania, and knowing that, I did everything within my power to make that happen. WrestleMania 15 was going to headline with Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock and Mick Foley competing in a 3-way match to determine the WWF champion. Vince agreed to it, and we were set. The Raw that was already written for that week was to lay down the groundwork for the match. Well, when we arrived at the building, Shawn Michaels made an appearance, an unbooked, unanticipated, unexpected appearance. Shawn got in Austin's ear and somehow convinced Steve that the WrestleMania 15 main event should just be himself and The Rock. Austin, who was on the surface a good friend of Mick's, then went to Vince, and as he had done before when it came to talent, Vince caved, or changed his mind. Mick was out, just like that. I was nuts at Shawn, livid. If anyone deserved to be in the main event at Mania, it was Mick. And of course, nobody had the Spaldings to tell Mick he was out, so I had to do it. Looking in his eyes that day, he was crushed. We both knew it was absolutely wrong, but that's how the business is, most of the time. Later on, I think I buried Shawn to somebody, probably Hunter. After catching wind of it, the Heartbreak Kid threatened to kick my butt if I said another word. I think his exact words were, "I know I can take you." Whether Shawn wanted to kick my butt or not didn't really matter to me at the time. What mattered was that a good man took the hammer. But, as always, Mick did business without ever saying a word. That's just the way Mick is. Following WrestleMania 15 and the headaches leading up to it, Vince never wanted to see or hear from Shawn Michaels again. He was just flat out done with him. But there I was at Vince's house every week lobbying to bring back the Heartbreak Kid. Right around the corner from my office on the second floor of Titan Tower was the costume department, where this woman, whose name now escapes me, would work up drawings of concepts for new WWF characters. Rummaging through her office when she wasn't there was a great way for me to keep up with the creative ideas they had in store for the poor, innocent, unsuspecting fans. At the time, there was a character running around the Federation by the name of Who. Who was Jim the Anvil Neidhart under a mask, but nobody was supposed to know that. Bruce Pritchard once explained to me that Who was supposed to be some sort of cheap shot directed at Hulk Hogan, who was then with WCW. To this day, I fail to see the connection, but then again, Bruce may have seen many things that other people couldn't see. Anyway, Bruce continued on with the character Who to mainly entertain himself. The real joke was, however, nobody else was getting it. But that wasn't bad enough. As I was sifting through drawings on the designer's desk, I came across a sketch for Who's tag team partner, What. More than anything else, this should represent just how far apart the two companies were at the time. The WCW was doing Hall and Nash, the Outsiders, and we were doing Who and What. There's no doubt in my mind that Who and What would have appeared on television if the landscape hadn't changed. It was sometime in late January 2000 when I received a phone call from Brad Siegel, the executive in charge of TBS and TNT. "Vince, there's someone I want you to talk to. He'll be calling you." That's all Brad said. However, that's all he had to say. I knew immediately who Brad was speaking of. I knew that the next call was going to come from Eric Bischoff. It was no secret that Brad was a huge Eric fan. The only real opinion I had of Eric at that time was from my one and only phone conversation with him. It was probably back in late 96 or early 97, during which time he was the cock of the walk and he knew it. Almost needless to say, his manner reflected this. During that conversation, he just came across as arrogant, as if he were doing me a favour by just talking to me. In his defense, he probably was doing me a favor. At that time, I was just a nobody looking for a chance, an opportunity, one that Eric Bischoff never gave me. From the start, Eric and I never liked each other and never trusted each other. We were cordial to each other because neither one of us had a choice in the matter. I was never asked if I wanted to work with Eric Bischoff, and I'm almost certain he was never asked if he wanted to work with me. If we were, I'm certain both of us would have said thanks, but no thanks. Add to that I had no idea what the packing order was. Was I now reporting to Eric? Was he a consultant? Brad never laid any of that out to me anyway. It's nothing personal against Eric at all. We were just two totally different animals with two completely different styles and approaches. I started to get the feeling that Eric didn't know a good show from a bad show until the internet told him Tuesday morning. Again, not only in defense of me, but in defense of the entire creative team. I started having a huge problem with this. We're spending hours on the show and you're going to negatively critique it only after it aired? What about before? Isn't that the way it's supposed to work? Eric was always a main event guy. I was always a mid-card and below guy. Why? Because on many occasions you couldn't tell the veterans anything, especially at WCW. In their minds, since they're making a ton of money, they knew everything. The less experienced talent would hang on to every word you said because they wanted to get better. It's those guys I'm in the business for to this day. It's an honour and a pleasure to share with them every ounce of knowledge I have in my 17 years in this business, and that's where Eric and I had massive, unfixable differences. To this day, it boggles my mind when I'm told of the negative tone that Ric Flair had towards me in his autobiography. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not looking for a standing ovation here, but the truth is, I coddled his son like no other. I took care of David and put David centre stage when others, even some on my own committee, saw nothing in him. I would think that Rick would have seen that and maybe even appreciated it, but I don't know if he ever did. And to be blatantly honest here, I will never understand that. However, in wanting to make something crystal clear here, I never did any of that for Eric. I did it all for David. In my eyes, he was deserving, he had a terrific attitude, and was extremely respectful. That's all anyone could ask. Since this is a book based 100% on honesty, let me also set the record straight on something. Sometime during my angle with Flair, the Nature Boy approached me with an idea. Vince, what if you shaved my head? Now, even in the wildest imagination of Vince Russo, that thought would have never even have crossed my mind. I mean, we're talking about Ric Flair for crying out loud, and out of respect alone, I would have never even thought of such a dastardly deed. I remember adamantly trying to talk Rick out of it, but the truth is, he insisted. You can only imagine how shocked and surprised I was when, in his own book, in his own words, while taking yet another shot at me, Rick suggested that the head shaving idea was my brainchild from the start. I get tickled, absolutely tickled, when I hear the critics say that Vince Russo killed WCW. Man, that's a lot of hard work and dedication for just one man in just under a 3-month span, because that's exactly how long I had any kind of control at WCW. I mean, to take a 13-year-old company and utterly destroy it in a matter of 3 months, I'm Cloverfield, that alien that took Manhattan down in a day, so I guess anything's possible. Going back to 1988, remember that WCW was Ted Turner's brainchild. He was behind it and gave it his full support. Well, when I showed up on the scene, Ted was well on his way out. The AOL Time Warner merger had just taken place, and a whole new sea of bigwigs were now looking down their snouts at grown men groveling around in their underwear. Regardless of the ratings, they didn't want it. To them, they were a legitimate television station, and wrestling was a joke. The nameless and faceless suits killed WCW, not Vince Russo, not Eric Bischoff, not Hulk Hogan's salary. You definitely have more of a case if you want to argue that WCW almost killed Vince Russo. Never in my entire life have I had to deal with such depression. It was crippling, it was taking my very life from me. As a man, a husband and a father, I uprooted my entire family to move to Atlanta, Georgia to work for WCW. I stripped them of all the security they knew, only for Bill Bush to tell me 90 days later that they, WCW, were going in a new direction. I took Will, VJ and Annie from family and friends. I took them from their schools and familiar surroundings. I took everything from my wife, Amy, that she had built in her life to work for a company that was never worthy of her sacrifices. Never. Those who were responsible for ousting me should have been ashamed of themselves. In order for them to jump a spot, they buried an innocent family in the process. I was both ashamed and embarrassed, and depressed, very depressed. I spent days and nights in the basement of my house, too defeated to even rear my ugly head. I felt I'd let my family down, and as the provider, there was nothing worse in the world. The quotes I've given you here are just the tip of the iceberg, and as mentioned at the top of this video, I actually enjoyed reading these because Russo's just so different from your average pro wrestling personality. You don't need to be a fan to get something out of the books. You might find things to laugh at, you might find things that make you seethe a little, but that's what Vince wants from his readers. He wants to get a reaction while telling his side of the story. Whether you believe his words or whether you believe the other side of the coin, that's totally up to you. But Russo does a great job of transporting you back to the Wild West days of pro wrestling, and that kind of stuff's right up my alley. Both books are still available on Russo's site, by the way, so pick them up if you want to read more. Thank you very much for watching, folks, and please take care. Alright, so we're going to do some more book quotes in today's video, and I'm not going to pretend I just read all these books recently. Jericho's written a total of 5 books. I read the first 3 ages ago, and today I'll be picking out some of the more memorable things Jericho wrote in those books. He's written so much over the years that it would take hours and hours to recite every notable quote, but these are the ones I thought you'd enjoy from his first 3 autobiographies. Those first 3 autobiographies being his best, in my opinion. Also, some of these quotes have been shortened to fit a video format. Grab the books yourself if you want the full stories. The social aspects of WCW were disheartening. The locker room was infested with politics and cliques, and the office gave special treatment to the powerful ones. Hogan and Savage had their own dressing rooms and didn't really talk to anybody else. Hall and Nash were in their own little unit and acted above everyone. Other guys like Scott Steiner, DDP, Paul White and Booker T later became my friends, but within the WCW environment they seemed uptight and defensive. Booker even balked at working with Dean, Eddie and me, complaining I ain't no cruiserweight, as if he would get leprosy from touching us. As smart as Eric Bischoff was, he conceded so much power to Hogan, Hall and Nash that they pretty much ran the show. The booking team would hammer out a Nitro episode, and an hour before the show, the NWO would rewrite it. Some nights we still didn't know the lineup 10 minutes before the show aired live to millions of people. Their attitude towards their work was piss poor as well. I overheard Scott Hall asking Bret Hart one night in Huntsville, Alabama, "Why do you care so much about this match? It's just a house show." That attitude was shared by head booker Kevin Sullivan, who asked me once, "Why do you care so much about your match? Nobody else does. Just go in the ring and get it over with. This company's the Titanic heading towards the iceberg anyways." It was great to hear such positive words from the man who was technically in charge of my on-screen career. The NWO had expanded to ridiculous proportions from its origins as a 3-piece. How many of you remember Virgil, Ted DiBiase and Mike Rotunda as NWO members? How about Horace Hogan, Buff Bagwell and Bryan Adams? Most of the group was made up of ex-WWF superstars, and it was obvious that Eric was enamored with Vince's old employees and wanted them in his top heel group. But his idea backfired when all the new additions caused the NWO to lose its edge. That's why I turned down Eric's offer to join. After all my bitching about not getting a fair shake, it was crazy to say no to the NWO, but bear with me. I was booked to win the WCW television title in Rapid City, South Dakota, which was a big deal for me on many levels. Winning the TV title would give me my ticket to ride out of Cruiserweight Purgatory and into Big Boy Land. But the decision for me to get the big win over champion Stevie Ray was made a scant 20 minutes before Nitro went live to air. Eric told me that the Giant was going to assist me with my victory and I would then join the NWO, but the dilution of the NWO meant that the majority of the members never had anything to do. When they came to the ring for their weekly endless opening promo, there wasn't enough room for all of them in the ring. They stood around laughing among themselves, knowing that they were rarely on camera because there were too many of them to be in one shot. At that point, I was doing just fine on my own. I got interview time in segments that revolved around me. I was over despite the NWO's dominance, and I would only get less over and lost in the shuffle if I joined them. So I thought about it and respectfully told Eric my thoughts on his invitation. I think it would be cool, but I've got a good thing going and I don't want to give that up by joining the NWO. I don't want to ride on your coattails and I don't want you guys to ride on mine. It was a brash statement, but Eric didn't seem to care and he said, if you don't want to be in the NWO, that's fine, but I still want the Giant to help you win the TV title, so let's keep the same finish. We'll figure out why he helped you later. They never did. When I first came to WWE, Triple H gave me his phone number and said, if you ever need anything, give me a call. A few days later in San Jose, I didn't know how to get to the venue, so I took him up on his offer. Hey man, it's Jericho here. Do you know how to get to the arena? Yeah, I know. Get a mop. I heard the laughter of his DX cronies in the background as he hung up. A few weeks later on Thanksgiving, DX did a bit where they went out on the streets to laugh at street people. They found a homeless man holding a sign that read, "We'll work for food." Triple H said, "Look at that guy, I bet he's a better worker than Jericho." The rest of DX, Road Dogg, Billy Gunn, X-Pac and China, nodded their heads and guffawed at their leader's wit. I confronted him about it later and he said, with a smirk, "Yeah, I thought you'd find that funny." I didn't, but I understood the relevance of the comment. It was a direct shot at me, and once again I realised if I didn't do something to turn the tide, I'd be sent packing. One of the other things that bothered me about China was that while she trusted me and expected me to put together a good match, she never helped me by telling anybody else that. When we came through the gorilla position, everybody congratulated her on her match. Even though she had worked hard and done a good job, she just stood there and accepted the praise solo, smiling as if she had just wrestled herself. We had a match at Armageddon. It was a big night for me because I was going to win the title from China and become the Intercontinental Champion for the first time. When it was over, I walked through the curtain but couldn't find her anywhere. It was customary after a match to wait in gorilla for your opponent so you could congratulate each other and thank each other for the match, but she was nowhere to be found. I looked up and down the halls, checked the dressing rooms, and finally found her in Vince's office, conversing with Triple H. They stopped talking as soon as I walked in and looked up guiltily as if I'd caught them doing something wrong. I asked China if everything was okay. She said, "Yeah, I'm fine." I said, "Good match. I thought it went really well, huh?" "Yeah, it was good," she said woodenly. I noticed that she had the tiniest bit of a shiner under her eye, like she had caught a stiff shot. When I worked with her, I knew there would be some live rounds thrown and I had no problem with that. Neither did she. It was the way she liked to work. I could tell I'd interrupted something, so I thanked her again and left the office. I could feel two pairs of eyes boring a hole in my back as I did. The next day we're doing Raw in Tampa. I wasn't sure exactly what Vince wanted to talk to me about, but I was pretty certain he was going to congratulate me for stealing the show with China the night before. I knocked on his door and walked in to find him talking to Triple H. They gave me a strange look, similar to the one Triple H and China had given me the day before, and Vince asked me to come back in a few minutes. I went back to his office. This time Triple H was gone and Vince was with Jim Ross, the head of talent relations, and Jack Lanza. He told me to shut the door and take a seat, and surprisingly, he didn't look happy. As a matter of fact, he looked downright pissed. Vince looked at me in the eye and said, "What is your problem?" Pardon me? What the fuck is your problem? Uh-oh, my normally calm and collected boss was now swearing at me. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "What did you do to China yesterday, huh? You gave her a black eye? You were stiffing the shit out of her? How could you do that?" Caught off guard, I tried to defend myself. "It wasn't intentional, Vince. It's just part of the job sometimes. You know that." Vince's eyes bugged out and the veins in his neck pulsated as he said in a grovelly voice, "How could you do that, man? She's a woman." I didn't think it was prudent at that juncture to remind him that he was the one who told me to work strong and not to take it easy on her. Not that I had a chance to get a word in edgewise, as the Vin Man was just getting started. You don't have a fucking clue what you're doing out there. You're as green as grass and it's embarrassing. I was sold a bill of goods in bringing you here and you're not worth the paper your contract's printed on. Yikes, well that wasn't what I expected to hear when I walked into his office. I was in shock. The problem with you is that you're an elitist. You think you're better than everybody else, but you're not. You're the drizzling shits. Vince teased he was bringing the original NWO faction of Kevin Nash, Scott Hall and Hulk Hogan into the WWE for the first time ever. I wasn't the only one who was surprised or concerned that the three biggest contributors to the demise of WCW were getting a chance to spread their cancer in the WWE. There were quite a few members of the roster who remembered what it was like in WCW when the NWO was in power, and they weren't thrilled about their impending arrival. I expressed my concerns to The Undertaker, who listened intently before giving me his thoughts. The one thing that's different here is that Vince is the boss, he's in charge and we all know it. In WCW there were half a dozen bosses and that made it easy for everyone to get what they wanted. These guys are going to do business and do what they're told, and if they don't, they won't last. I'll make sure of it. With that, he waved his hand and disappeared in a cloud of smoke. The master had spoken. Nash attempted to bust my balls right off the bat by commenting on the bright red colour I dyed in the tips of my hair, inspired by Ozzy's latest quaff. Nice dye job there, Jericho. Not missing a beat, I fired back. Well, some of us dye our hair red when it's blonde, and some of us dye our hair when it's grey. The truth hurt, and Nash's sarcastic smile faded like his hair pigment. Hall was the last to arrive and was all phony smiles and fake hellos, but I could see his true self waiting to emerge like a shark beneath the surface. It didn't take long for Jaws to attack, as only 5 minutes later he shook Bubba Ray Dudley's hand and murmured in his deep voice, "I love the 3D, what a great finishing move, can't wait to kick out of it." Hall was full of such witticisms and was always saying things like, "It's the wrestling business, not the wrestling friendness," and "It doesn't say anywhere in my contract that I have to be nice to anybody." That was his old WCW attitude, but that shit wasn't gonna fly here. The WWE was about making money, not a corporate sandbox where you could drop trow and take a dump ski whenever you felt like it. Nash enjoyed working with me and wanted to continue doing so, albeit in a different way. He discussed the idea of becoming my bodyguard, or Slacky as he put it, similar to what he did with Shawn Michaels in 1993. I wasn't sold on it. My concern was moot, as Vince told me he wasn't considering the bodyguard idea anyway. A few months later, Hall and Nash were gone, with Hogan following soon after, and that was the end of the NWO in WWE. Goldberg was coming to the WWE. The announcement jackhammered through my stomach the moment I heard it. It was Goldfinch's first Raw, and I was working with Triple H versus Shawn Michaels and Booker T. After the match, I was pulled aside and informed that Goldsmith had spent the entire match barking to Nash about how I didn't know how to sell properly, and how I didn't want to do business with him in WCW. That pissed me off because I never had a problem selling for him or anybody else for that matter. I've always done business, and it was business I was trying to do when I wanted to put Bill over properly in WCW. I marched straight into the dressing room and saw Nash sitting in the corner like a giant praying mantis, acting like he owned the place, while Billy Boy sat across from him with a self-indulgent smile on his face. Throwing caution to the wind, I stood in front of him and stared directly into his eyes. "I heard you were saying some stuff about me during my match. I don't know if you realise it, but things have changed. This isn't WCW. If you have something to say to me, say it to my face." Goldberg gave a shaky laugh and said, "I didn't say anything about you." "Bullshit, I know you did." Something snapped in the Burgermeister and he jumped to his feet. "Oh yeah, what about all that stuff you were saying about me on the internet?" Internet? Internet? You've got to be kidding me. I didn't spend enough time on the internet to check out Club Jenna properly, let alone talk shit about Bill fucking Goldeye. What are you talking about? A vein in his neck popped out like a worm as he shouted back, "Mike Tenay told me that you said stuff about me on the internet." I looked at him in disbelief and said, "Listen Bill, it's simple. I could be your best friend in this company or your worst enemy. We're probably going to be working with each other at some point, and I could either make you look like $1 million or make you look like shit, and you wouldn't know the difference. We're all here to make money and do business together, so just fucking relax." You never wanted to do the job for me in WCW. You're a prima donna. You're totally wrong about that. Before I could finish the sentence, Goldfish grunted like a Neanderthal, the vein in his neck now resembling a corpulent slug, and he grabbed me by the throat. Once Goldster made his move, I reacted the only way I knew how. I swatted his hand off my throat and gave him a two-handed push to the chest. He rushed forward with his head down and tried to tackle me, like the ex-NFL lineman that he was. I stepped to the side like the world's worst matador and grabbed him in a front face lock. It was the only shoot hold I knew, one that harkened back to my days bouncing at Malarkey's in Calgary. I think I surprised the shit out of him with my lethal hold and was able to hold him down to the ground, applying pressure because I knew if I pushed his throat into his chest long enough, he might pass out. I really hoped that he would go to sleep because I was sure that he was going to fire up and kick the shit out of me. I mean, come on, have you ever seen this guy? He's massive. Goldfinger and I were separated, and if you've ever been in a fight that was broken up by your friends, you can probably relate to what happened next. As Christian and Hurricane were restraining me, they were inadvertently setting me up to be murdered at the same time, because when Goldworthy broke free of the pack, they still had my arms pinned to my sides. Let go, he's gonna kill me, I screamed, closing my eyes and preparing to have my face caved in. They realised what was going on and let me go at the last minute, but it was too late. He broke through and reared his fist back. I tensed up and prepared for him to knock my block off, but he started pulling my hair instead. I couldn't believe that the mighty Berggold was tugging at my hair like a 5-year-old during playtime. What was up with this guy? I screamed, "What the hell's wrong with you, man? You're acting like a goof." Goldrush screamed back, "Your mother's a fucking goof." Booker T got the most quizzical look on his face as he chewed on the unlit cigar he always seemed to have in his mouth and said, "Hold up, did you just say his mother's a goof? That's the worst insult I ever heard, man." Shawn stood in the ring at SummerSlam with his wife by his side, giving one of the best promos of his career. Just as the HBK chants reached their crescendo, my music cut them off and the cheers turned to boos. The fans knew something was coming, but nobody knew just how heavy it was gonna be. As Shawn and Rebecca turned their backs to walk away, I spun him around and threw a punch at his head. He ducked out of the way, leaving his wife directly in the line of fire, and I smacked her full force in the mouth. For real. Earlier in the day, we had gone over the whole scenario and I timed my punch to stop right before it made any contact with her. I've thrown thousands of working punches, as we call them, but this one was a little more important because it wasn't another trained worker I was swinging at, it was Shawn's wife we're talking about. In order to time it right, I told her not to move so I could judge the distance and throw the punch accordingly. Even though Rebecca had been in WCW for a short time working as Nitro Girl Whisper, she had never wrestled or taken a bump as far as I knew. But it didn't matter because if I executed the punch perfectly, it was going to look vicious. But I didn't execute it properly. When Shawn ducked, I leaned slightly forward and so did Rebecca. Neither of us meant to shift our positions, but we did, and in a total fluke, my fist smashed her right in the mouth. It wasn't a glancing blow either, I nailed her hard. I felt her lip mash against my knuckles like I'd popped a grape. She went down fast as the crowd gasped in horror. Shawn dropped to his knees beside her crying and I stood there helpless in disbelief. Before the show, Vince told me to act concerned about what I did, but not exaggeratedly. He didn't want me to show remorse, but he also didn't want me to laugh or act cocky. The look on my face said it all, as I was the kid at the birthday party who tried to get attention by pushing the cake on the floor but knew he had gone too far. But the look on my face wasn't an act. I felt like the biggest piece of shit on the planet and I knew I was in trouble. I could only imagine what Shawn was going to do to me when he got back through the curtain. After I had just knocked his wife out, if he wanted to knock me out in return, I was going to let him. It was the worst feeling ever, walking through Gorilla as everyone looked at me in silence, nervously waiting to see what kind of damage I'd caused. The paramedics were in the ring now, surrounding them, and when I saw the blood on her mouth, it made me want to puke. They carted her out on a stretcher, and when they got backstage, I kept repeating over and over again, "I am so sorry, man, I am so sorry." The doctors tended to Rebecca as Shawn stared at me blankly like he wanted to kill me. He finally broke the silence. "I never should have allowed this to happen. This never should have happened. I can't believe I brought my family into this." If it was possible to feel worse than me, he did. We were both staring at our feet in silence, waiting to see if Rebecca was okay, when she suddenly sat up off the stretcher and looked me in the eye. "Is that the best you've got, Jericho?" she said with a crooked smile. Shawn and I looked at each other and started laughing as he gave his wife a hug. Thankfully, Rebecca was alright, her teeth were fine, and even though I'd given her quite the fat lip, no stitches were necessary. She didn't make either of us feel any guiltier about what had happened, but I still felt horrible and sent her flowers later in the week to apologise. But once we knew for sure that she was okay, Shawn and I realised that the accidental punch in the moosh was the best thing that could have happened to our angle. The story now ceased to be fiction, it had just crossed over into reality. CM Punk came down to the ring and got a good reaction when he hopped on the apron, waving a Brazilian flag that a ringside fan had given him. As he marched past me, brandishing the banner, I thought about snatching it out of his hand, but he didn't come close enough. He draped it on the turnbuckle and Ref Mike Chioda took it to hand it back to the fan. "No, give me that flag, Mikey," I hissed. I wanted to do something to wake the crowd up, so I took the flag from Chioda, dropped it to the mat, stomped on it twice, and kicked it to the floor in a hail of boos. It was a standard heel tactic that I'd used many times before, but even that didn't get the response I was expecting. People were mad, but not jumping out of their seats wanting to kill me mad, which was what I was hoping for. We began the match and I just started getting heat on Punk about 5 minutes later when I noticed out of the corner of my eye a second ref in the ring. Did Chioda get hurt? "Stop the match now," Charles Robinson whispered in my ear, but I ignored him and continued my beatdown. "Seriously, Chris, you have to stop the match now and apologise for kicking the flag or you're going to get arrested." The entranceway was now swarming with Brazilian soldiers, all of them glaring at me. Then John Laurinaitis ran down the aisle waving his arms and yelling, "You need to apologise now, Chris. This is real, so don't joke around." I could tell by Johnny's demeanour that this was some serious shit going on, so I grabbed the mic in the centre of the ring and addressed the crowd as Punk sold his beatdown in the corner. "I just want to say that I would never purposely disrespect the country of Brazil or your beautiful flag. I did what I did to entertain you, and I would like to sincerely apologise to everyone here in the arena and to the entire country of Brazil. I'm sorry." The crowd applauded respectfully but seemed a bit confused, as if they were wondering why I was apologising in the first place. I turned my attention back to Punk, who had been waiting in the corner patiently, and like a kid yelling "Game on" as a car zooms by in the middle of a street hockey game, I continued the match. I felt that having to give the apology in the middle of the match was a little over dramatic, but if that's what the authorities needed in order to calm down, then so be it. But when I walked through the curtain, everybody was staring at me with a threatening glare. I went past a group of soldiers and their eyes bored a hole straight through me, with one older guy in particular giving me the real stink eye. "When you kicked the flag, that old guy went crazy. He's some sort of colonel and wanted to rush to the ring and arrest you right there and then. We had to beg the guy not to do it and he settled for an apology, but he's still furious. He thinks all of this is real and wants to take you right to jail." I could only imagine having to spend the night in a Brazilian prison wearing nothing but my sparkly short little wrestling trunks. I'd be targeted as a ladyboy instantly. That was a dash of cold water reality and I realised just how much trouble I was in. I hurried back to the dressing room and changed my clothes just in case the colonel changed his mind and decided to take me away. I also thought I'd better text Vince. I shot him a message explaining that I'd upset the Brazilian army by kicking a flag and I wouldn't do it again on future tours. Vince replied immediately, "There will be no more Brazilian tours for you or any of us. The WWE will no longer be allowed to perform in Brazil in the future." What the fuck, Chris? We were in the O2 Arena in London and I was against Cena in the main event. DX were having problems getting approval to sell their trademark neon green glow sticks at the show because the O2 brass were afraid fans would throw them and hurt somebody. Eventually they got it worked out and the sticks were selling quicker than Molly at a rave. I was in the middle of a pre-match promo explaining how all Londoners were hypocritical, gelatinous parasites with bad teeth when someone threw a glow stick and hit me right in the eye. I was surprised and my eye was pounding, so I angrily surveyed the crowd, looking for the culprit. "You wanna throw stuff? I'd love to find the son of a bitch who threw that glow stick. You wanna throw stuff? Go for it, come on, throw some stuff," I yelled into the mic. The crowd obliged and showered me with a hailstorm of neon green glow sticks. It started like most storms do, with a few drops here and there, but when it kicked in, it was a gargantuan green glow stick gale. I saw the first few flying through the air and batted them away easily like Obi-Wan Kenobi during his Jedi trials, but as the bombardment built, I stood my ground and took it like a boss. I was the most hated man in Great Britain and it felt jolly good. When I walked through the curtain afterward, instead of receiving salutations and congratulations, everyone seemed to be avoiding me. Apparently, a little boy had been hit by an errant glow stick and had been brought backstage to calm him down and pacify the situation. DX had taken photos with the kid and given him some merch, so all was well, except DX were not happy with me. Hunter made a point of walking into the dressing room to let me know he and Shawn had saved my ass by taking care of the little guy. I felt bad the kid got hit, but I didn't understand what Triple H was so mad about. It was an amazing heel moment, the best reaction any villain worth his handful of salt could hope for. I took a shower and was on the bus, waiting to travel to the next city, when I got a call from Laurinaitis telling me that Stephanie wanted to fine me $10,000 for provoking the incident. I couldn't believe it. I was going to get punished for getting hate. Let's not forget that I was the one who got hit with the damn glow stick in the first place and had the black eye to prove it. I was so irate that I called Vince directly. My phone buzzed as I received a text from the boss. "Take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. You get heat naturally." I wasn't exactly sure what he was saying, but I assumed that any text that included a smiley face meant I was off the hook. It turned out I was. Despite what Hunter and Stephanie thought, Vince obviously loved what I'd done and I never heard another word about it. As mentioned at the top of this video, these quotes have been shortened to fit into a YouTube video, and I highly recommend checking out Chris's books if you want to learn more. They're very well written, and while they do get a bit Fozzy-centric in later books, his first 2 autobiographies, A Lion's Tale and Undisputed, come highly recommended. Lion's Tale in particular is a fantastic read, and you don't need to be a Chris Jericho fan to enjoy his stories. Thanks for watching, folks. I am still making my way through that Diana Hart book, and I really don't know how I'm going to present it because, well, fact-checking super important, and bringing legit documented counter-arguments to Diana's claims is a real tough task, but I will get it done eventually. Thanks again, folks, and please take care. Alright, welcome back to the Wrestling Bios Book Club. This week we'll be checking out quotes from Mick Foley's books. Have a Nice Day, Foley is Good, The Hardcore Diaries, and Countdown to Lockdown. I've picked out quotes that I think you guys would enjoy. As Foley wrote more books, he would get a bit spicier in terms of what he said, so we'll do this one in chronological order. As always, these quotes have been trimmed down to fit a video format. You'll get much more context by actually picking up the books and reading them for yourself. So let this video serve as a little sample of what you can expect if you read Mick Foley's autobiographies. On the first day of the tour, Ric Flair, or Booker, wrestling vernacular for the guy who makes or breaks you, admitted he wasn't familiar with my work as a babyface, a good guy. Now, Flair was a legendary performer in the ring, great charisma, conditioning and promos that could raise goosebumps on your arm, but apparently preparation wasn't the Nature Boy's forte. Not familiar with my work? What the hell does that mean? It's his job to be familiar. I'd been a babyface for all of his 14 months back with the company. I'd main evented pay-per-views that he wrestled on. Not being familiar with the talent he was in charge of meant that, in my book, he was every bit as bad on the booking side as he was great on the wrestling side of it. Flair had talked to me for a long time about changing the course of my career. Nate felt that I needed to be a heel, a bad guy. His rationale was simple. You and Vader had the most brutal bouts I've ever witnessed, began Flair in his trademark voice, a strange combination of lisping and perfect enunciation. But your rematch didn't raise the ratings at all. Nobody cares about you as a babyface. In other words, Flair was holding my 15 minutes on air responsible for the ratings of the entire 2-hour show. He also failed to realise that ratings increases are more of a result of trends and ongoing storylines than just one match. The backstage area was in a state of disbelief. Actually, a state of shock might be a more accurate description. I was really upset by what I'd just seen. You don't do that to a guy like Bret Hart, is all I could say for minutes as I repeated it over and over. I began to get angrier as time went by. How can they expect me to work here after this? I said to Pat Patterson, who was visibly upset by what had just transpired. I know, said Pat with tears welling up in his eyes. I can't believe it myself. I wasn't mad at Pat, but gave him a message to give my boss, who, at that specific time, I detested. Tell Vince I'm not coming to work tomorrow. Several other wrestlers also echoed my sentiments about not wanting to work for the company. I saw Vince Russo, our head writer, who also looked greatly stressed. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," I said to Russo, without knowing that he had been innocent of the deception. Russo later told me that those words hurt him worse than anything he had ever experienced. I stormed out of the arena. I was not shy about letting my feelings be known. "I'm not working for this damn company anymore," I spat out emotionally. I called Jim Ross first and left a message that said, "Tell Vince I'm not coming to work. I'm sick to my stomach and don't feel like I can work here anymore. If you have any questions, you can call me at the Quality Inn." Next, I dialed Bret, who was staying in another hotel. He wasn't in, but I left a message repeating sentiments I explained to Ross and giving him my support. I watched Raw with great anticipation, but was devastated to see that instead of admitting to their mistake, the World Wrestling Federation was actually playing it up. They were mocking Bret, and I was disgusted. One by one, I saw wrestlers appear on the screen who told me only one night earlier that they wouldn't be working anymore. I realised that I had absolutely no pull. It was the difference between robbing a store with a real gun and robbing a store with a water pistol. Later that night, I received a call from Jim Cornette and we talked for close to 2 hours. He made me see that even if none of us approved of what Vince had done, we had to understand that he did what he felt was best for the company. WCW was hell-bent on destroying Vince by any means necessary, and when it came to Vince McMahon, Ted Turner did indeed have very deep pockets. I had seen the World Wrestling Federation Women's Champion show up on Nitro with her belt and throw it in the garbage. It wouldn't be beneath WCW to offer Bret a couple of $100 extra grand to do it as well. The Federation had always been able to make its world title mean something. Without it, the company would be in a gigantic hole. Finally, my decision came down to money. I respected Bret and I liked him a great deal personally, but I had to feel that he was going to be alright. He would have about $2 million a year to fall back on, while I would have nothing. I just kept thinking about the figures. 2 million to 0, 0 to 2 million. With great reservation, I showed up at TV tapings the following afternoon. I wanted this to be a real I Quit match. I wanted there to be a definite winner and a definite loser, and I wanted the fans to see a side of The Rock that they could truly despise. I also wanted to explore the devastating effects, not so much physical but mental, that such a match would have on a guy who had built his reputation and career on never giving up. After 8 chair shots, I turned my back to The Rock and began stumbling up the aisle. This was my non-verbal cue for The Rock to hit me in the back of the head, knock me out, and end this massacre. By this point, my defiance was gone, as was my sense of disbelief. I knew exactly what was going on. I was in a match that had gotten carried away. I was suffering a great deal, and I wanted it to end. Unfortunately, The Rock didn't pick up on my non-verbal cue as he ran a circle around me and smashed me another time on the top of the head. On the bright side, it seemed that my goal of showing his mean streak was being achieved. I was disoriented from the blows and had to be helped to the back, but once I was there, my focus returned to where it should have been all along. Where are my kids? I was pointed to them, and as I reached them, the other wrestlers saw me and gave me a standing ovation. I'm okay, I assured Colette, although I probably should have been asking them if they were okay as well. When I left the arena, I was troubled by the fact that one wrestler had not come in and checked on me. This would bother me for a long time, and in truth, it's something that I have still not forgotten, nor entirely forgiven. Of all the visitors who came into that room, The Rock was not among them. These quotes centre around the night Mick won the WWF title from The Rock while WCW presented the Finger Poke of Doom on Nitro. Raw was taped this week, so Mick was able to watch Nitro after he won the WWF title. After about the 4th poorly executed Goldberg vignette, I turned to my newspaper until the unlikely mention of my name on the WCW show jolted my attention back to the screen. The words that spewed forth from announcer Tony Schiavone's mouth simultaneously shocked, hurt and angered me. "We have been informed," Schiavone began, "that Mick Foley, who used to wrestle here in WCW as Cactus Jack and now wrestles as Mankind, is going to win the World Wrestling Federation title tonight on their program, which is a taped show." I couldn't believe it. Then Schiavone continued with the biggest insult of my career when he sarcastically said, "Wow, now that's going to put a lot of asses in the seats." I was so hot that I immediately wanted to call him and blister him on his answering machine. Instead, I decided to wait. I watched and discussed as he made several other insulting comments about me during their show, and then tried to go to sleep while I hoped the Nielsen rating would vindicate me. The next afternoon, I called the World Wrestling Federation offices, and not only did my anger and pain disappear, they were replaced with an unbelievable rush of joy and a thirst for vengeance. The rating showed that almost 100,000 households switched over to the World Wrestling Federation show immediately following Schiavone's comment. Immediately. So not only did their company come across like scumbags for insulting someone whom the fans held in some measure of respect, but they also cost themselves a hell of a lot of viewers. WCW did win the 5-minute time period following my title victory, which was actually even worse news for them. It meant that people were, in fact, interested in their title rematch, but had been driven away by their own announcers' foolish remarks. So now, with the ratings on my side, I decided to give Mr. Schiavone a call. I had known Tony for quite a while and had always gotten along with him, and even though I didn't think he was in Jim Ross's league, I always respected him as an announcer. Deep down, I sensed that Tony's words were not derived from feelings of his own, but were probably ordered upon him by one of his superiors. I got Tony's answering machine and resisted the urge to yell. Instead, I very calmly said, "Tony, this is Mick Foley, and I just wanted to say that I heard your comments and they made me sick. Why you would insult someone who works so hard for your company is beyond me. I have a feeling that the words you were saying weren't your own, but either way, I felt that it was low class and uncalled for, and in truth, it just caused more people to watch our show." Then I left my number and hung up. A few hours later, the phone rang. When Tony spoke, he did indeed sound sad. As I had thought, the feelings were not his own, but had been forced on him by his superior. Right, Eric? Schiavone's words not only haunted him that night, but for weeks, months, and even years after. I had never heard the Misfits' music, but knew of their reputation as a hardcore band with a loyal, somewhat weird following. The guys dressed demonically and sang of such subjects as murder and decapitation. No, they don't write the music for Disney films. I liked Jerry so much that I was proud to accept his gift package of evil looking skull t-shirts and CDs. As a matter of fact, I couldn't wait to slide that CD in as soon as I got in my car, and slide it in I did, and waited for Jerry's groovy bass lines to take me away to another place in my mind. Hey, maybe the Misfits would be my new band to inspire me to a whole new level of matches and interviews. 11 seconds later, I pressed eject and the CD slid out, never to play again. I hope this doesn't hurt Jerry's feelings. He really is a great guy, but I guess that could be somewhat akin to somebody saying, "Hey Mick, I read your book and you sound like a great guy, but as a wrestler, you suck." But honestly, if I were forced to make a decision at gunpoint between listening to the Misfits and watching a best of test video, I think I'd watch the video, even if it had the Rodney match on it. I had been fired with the general understanding that I would come back to battle Vince at WrestleMania 17, probably with my commissioner's job hanging in the balance. Simple premise, right? Had I been in touch, I simply could have heard their idea, told them that it didn't make sense, proposed the better one, had that shot down, reached a compromise, and come back to vanquish Vince at Mania. Instead, I heard the idea about a day before its scheduled shooting, got cold feet and called up Vince, saying something about never wrestling again, blaming it on fear of one final devastating head injury. WrestleMania was salvaged. In fact, it may have been the greatest WrestleMania of them all. I even refereed Vince's match with Shane, and aside from considering the possibility that Vince nailing me in the back of the head with a chair, it was supposed to be the upper back, was not entirely unintentional, I thought all was again well in our relationship. But in retrospect, I always look at my decision to bow out of WrestleMania, a decision that probably cost me a few bucks too, as the reason I would come to feel like the boy who cried wolf in Vince's eyes. I had been a wrestler, I had been the commissioner, I just felt like I was drying up, dying on the vine. There were other things I wanted to try in life without a WWE contract hanging over my head. It was in July 2001 that I asked for a meeting with Vince. I showed up in Stamford with a list of grievances, but the moment I sat down, I just went for broke and asked for my release from the company. What ensued was fairly ugly, a shouting match that echoed through the halls of Titan Towers and shook the very foundation of our business and personal relationship. No, I didn't get the release, at least not at that time, but I did get something else: confidence. Yelling at Vince had been very therapeutic. I had stood my ground, made my points, knocked away many of his contentions, and in the process gained a new belief in myself. I specifically remember the outcome of one of those verbal volleys with Vince. He was contending that the WWE machine had made me who I was, and that it therefore wouldn't be fair for me to just walk away from it. I said, Vince, if that's true, how come my most popular character was actually Commissioner Foley, which was just me dressed in my regular clothes, acting like myself? That's not true, Vince said, although he damn sure knew it was. For although my Commissioner character didn't sell merchandise, I didn't even have a shirt or drive pay-per-views. In terms of recognition and response, none of the other characters I'd played came close. It is true, Vince, I said. And Vince said, no, that would be dude love. I'd done it, point Foley. By opting for such a ludicrous joke, Vince had conceded that particular round of the Great July shouting match. It seems that every few years, JR gets taken for granted and is sent out to pasture, and every time he comes back with a renewed, albeit temporary sense of respect from WWE. I sincerely hope that respect will at some time become permanent. While I'm on the subject of JR, let me take the time to send a personal message to Vince concerning his 2005 treatment of JR, which I'm sure WWE employees will be hustling to have edited, and which, no doubt, Vince will read and respond to with, if that's the way he feels, print it. Vince, colon surgery is serious. Not only that, it's a sensitive issue. It's not funny. Exploiting it and humiliating a loyal employee because of it is not only in poor taste, but downright baffling to me. As far as I know, only one person found it funny. You. Just before reading this quote, keep in mind that the Hardcore Diaries book was published in 2007. The sentiment shared here still echoes true all these years later. I think there's an even bigger long-term danger to the scripting process. It eliminates the need for a wrestler to think for himself. Many of today's superstars have never seen promo land, let alone taken up residence there. They have had no reason to. It's almost like a defunct mom-and-pop amusement park made obsolete by the advent of computer technology. But just as there will always be a place for the classic out-and-back wooden roller coaster in today's world of high-tech, big-dollar thrill rides, there will always be a place for the heartfelt promo in today's tightly scripted sports entertainment environment. I don't like when WWE superstars publicly run down each other's in-ring skills. To me, it cheapens the product, making our fans feel like they're watching a cavalcade of no-talent stiffs instead of world-class sports entertainers. For example, in the build-up to Mania, Triple H voiced his opinion that John Cena was not a very good wrestler. Then, why is Cena our world champion? And how did that comment make Triple H look when he lost to someone who wasn't very good? Like someone who was a little worse than not very good? Which would be what? Lousy? Or even if he had won, who would he have beaten? A guy who was not a very good wrestler, which would make Triple H what? A little better than not very good? Or average? Not me. No, if someone's gonna beat me, he'd better be damn good. Or at the very least, someone I can claim is damn good. Which reminds me of one of the all-time great wrestling boasts, one which I've utilised occasionally over the years. It takes a good man to beat me, but it doesn't take him very long. I'd read off and on for months that I had heat with people behind the scenes, and that my depictions of the WWE creative process hadn't won me any new friends within the company. The Wrestling Observer hinted that Triple H was not among my biggest fans, which struck me as odd since I'd been fairly influential in his career in 2000, when he was making the transition from popular performer to legitimate main event bad guy. To which I say to Triple H, brother, that's okay, honestly. First of all, I was paid for those matches with Triple H, paid really well too. It wasn't like I helped him move into a new apartment or lent him money when he was down. Second, whether I was helpful to his career or not, Triple H is part of the McMahon family. He owes it to Vince and Linda, and Shane and Stephanie, as well as the shareholders and fans, to offer his best opinion, based on what's best for the company, not based on who may have been beneficial to his career. In all the years I worked for them, my wife never felt completely comfortable with WWE, dating back to the time in Bangor, Maine, summer of 1996, when a WWE agent told me my family wasn't allowed backstage and ushered them into a dingy bathroom with an exposed sewage pipe, enabling the pleasant scent of human excrement, referred to as poo-poo and pee-pee at the time, to become part of my family's first collective WWE memory. In November of that year, I was specifically told that no family members were allowed backstage at Madison Square Garden for the Survivor Series, which my wife and kids had specifically flown in for from Florida. So they stayed at the hotel all day, away from a dad they didn't get to see all that often back then, while the backstage area filled up with fiancés and other wrestlers, girlfriends of other wrestlers, casual romantic flings of other wrestlers, and a host of college buddies, workout partners, guys who knew somebody who used to work security. A year later, when negotiating a new contract by myself before Barry Bloom started making my professional life a lot easier, I brought these issues up with Vince, who gave me his personal guarantee that nothing like that would ever happen again. It didn't, but after hearing Vince compare her to Robin Gibbons in a radio interview, Colette never felt comfortable at a WWE event again. Maybe that's why nobody in the company has had my home telephone number these past 10 or so years. Oddly, I gave the number to TNA owner Dixie Carter the very first time I spoke with her. To this day, I'm not sure if the idea of putting me on the SmackDown announce team was one that had been on Vince's mind for months, or if it had come to him the moment he saw me. Vince can be a little spontaneous sometimes. I had been concerned about my tendency to become too much of a straight man during commentary, choosing analysis and insight over humour and personality, but Kevin Dunn, Vince's second in command, had assured me that I'd be given time to grow into the role, and they had no doubt that my personality, charm, humour, likability, rugged sexiness and humility would eventually shine through. Nonetheless, I'd like the actual content of the headphone head games to be left between Vince and myself, and between you and your imaginations, the way Hitchcock did with horror films. Just imagine it's a horror story and the language used was more horrible than the most horrible language you've ever experienced. Or better yet, imagine it's a fantasy movie and the hero of this movie puts on a special set of magic headsets. Yes, they are magic, because from the very instant our hero places them on his head, all the respect he thought he had earned over the course of 12 years working for Mr. McMagical simply disappeared. At one point, after Mr. McMagical used the magic headsets to transmit his unhappiness to our hero for about the 5th time in one evening, the hero began wondering why he still remained at the table at all. Certainly, his pride told him to flee the offensive table, to throw down the magic headsets and leave this arena where previously he had been the hero. The best our hero could do was muster the thimbleful of fortitude needed to make his feelings known to Mr. McMagical via an incredible device known as a Cellular phone. Yes, while heading to the land of giant Legos, also known as Legoland, in the town of Carlsbad, the state of California, our hero made his feelings known. Hello, Mr. McMagical, this is Mick Foley, a heroic Irish name if there ever was one. And I just want you to know that I can't remember the last time I was spoken to so disrespectfully, and if this job involves being spoken to that way, I think you should find someone else to do it. You know, Mick Foley, Mr. McMagical said slowly and most unmagically. I apologise for that. I was having a bad night and I took it out on you. Just give me a chance to make it up to you and we'll just chalk it up to having a bad night. For a while, 3 weeks, maybe 4, things were fine. Then came the day the magic headphones once again stung our hero's ears. Once more a victim of Mr. McMagical's verbal venom. The venom started spewing forth more regularly, almost wiggly at some points, leaving our hero once again wondering why he remained at the table at all. For months, Booker T and Sharmell had been planning a Legends convention for Houston, their hometown, for WrestleMania weekend. I think WWE looks at any outside event as an intrusion, kind of an invasion of the creative space they carved out for themselves 25 years ago. I can understand that, but in truth, fans who travel from around the country and the globe are going to be, inherently, really into wrestling. They're already giving WWE a ton of money, injecting it into the city of Houston too. Within 24 hours of posting his Legends lineup on the web, Booker was faced with 6 cancellations, mysterious phone calls, texts, emails citing a cornucopia of cop-out causes. Double bookings, no compete clauses, family commitments. Just a week out from the convention, Booker was faced with a few more key withdrawals. I'll let you guys make up your own minds, but I think the truth is that most former WWE wrestlers, no matter how tenuous the nature of their departure, all secretly, probably not so secretly, long for that phone call, that welcome back pal call, the back in the family hug. I think I just hated to see Booker so down, especially when I thought I might have the answer to some of his problems. "Hey Book," I said, "do you want me to see if I can make the convention?" Foley's books are fantastic reads and each one offers something unique. You can feel Foley's mood change with every book and you can see his outlook on pro wrestling shift as time went on. As mentioned at the top of this video, I highly recommend checking out the books for yourself. They're pretty long books, but they're hard to put down, and let me know what you want covered the next time we open up the Wrestling Bios book club. Thank you very much for watching everyone, I do appreciate it, and please take care.